Hello, my name is Anastasia Battle. I'm an organizer with the LaRouche organization, and welcome to the LaRouche Show. And today I would like to introduce to you a very special lecture to me, which is part of a series that Mr. LaRouche did back in 1973 at Columbia University. This is part of a series that he did called Beyond Psychoanalysis. So it was paired with uh, a series of papers as well, which we'll link that down below in the description. But this lecture, we'll listen to the first one today, is very important at this time because, especially if you're new, you probably have run into a situation where maybe you're trying to talk to someone about the ideas that we're putting forward, and you keep running into a problem. Someone just doesn't get it, and you don't know why, and you're frustrated, or maybe the other person is frustrated, and it's just not coming together. And in this series, Mr. LaRouche gets at what are the laws of human thought. You can understand that. You can understand why somebody thinks the way that they do in real time as you're talking with them. You can understand what the axioms are and the assumptions that they're making while you're talking with them. And it's never really the words that someone says. And I'm not saying a person is lying, but words are a reflection of a thought. And if you can identify the assumptions that someone's making, then you can better understand how to help that person break through. Now, if you're going to help somebody do that, you also have to make the breakthrough yourself. You have to be able to reason through and understand your own mind, because there's a lot of stuff in there. We all have our own family situations. We've got culture. We've got the history that we're in as a nation or as a people at that moment. There are all sorts of things that are playing in to what makes a person neurotic. And actually, Mr. LaRouche said once, man, if you weren't so neurotic, you all be geniuses. This is true, right? So if we can work through these emotional ideological blocks and figure out how to control what Mr. LaRouche calls the oceanic emotion, then you are better equipped to communicate to another human being, another person, so they can understand their own mind and how they can make the breakthrough as well. I'm sure maybe you've experienced this as a young person or a child, that when you work really hard at something and then you get it, you solved a problem, it's all of a sudden everything just makes more sense. And you're so excited that you want to tell everybody, you want to talk to everyone about it. And that's what we want to evoke in people. It doesn't matter if somebody agrees with you on everything, but if you can give someone to have a thought, that is the greatest action that you could ever accomplish with that person. So in these lectures, and the paper included, I want you to take some time. You could pull aside a notepad, a pencil. Maybe Mr. LaRouche, will provoke you in some way. Maybe you're reacting to some words he's saying. I mean, he is talking about Marxism. This is the 70s, so, this may not jive with how you think. But really take some time to think about what he's saying. Identify what he's talking about. What are the different parts of the human mind that control you? Where did they come from? Think about how, if you've tried to talk to another person, what the difficulty was when that happened. Was there a reaction that you had that maybe prevented you from making a breakthrough with that person? Right? These are the key things to really analyze with ourselves right now. Not to, whip yourself and make yourself feel like crap or something, but you know, but to really challenge ourselves and not let ourselves off the hook at a revolutionary period, especially. If we're going to have a successful revolution, we cannot go along with a romantic idea of, if you just go out there and you chant some slogans and wave the flag hard enough, then we're going to win. Because I'm sorry, but that has never worked. It will never work. And oftentimes it ends in a pretty tragic failure. But actual successful revolutions come from an intellectual revolution. That doesn't mean, that you're going to become a professor or you're going to understand, every single thing in the universe. But it comes from being able to understand this process of human thought. And it's actually quite fun once you figure out how to work yourself through this, and you can begin to live in the tension of the moment and enjoy it. It can become a lot of fun once you learn how another person's mind works, because you understand yourself and you can see the reasoning process of another person. And the first time you get somebody to figure something out, you'll be just as excited as they are. So I'd like to leave that introduction there, and I hope you enjoy this, and feel free to message the LaRouche organization, or you can leave comments in the YouTube comment section below. If you have any reflections, definitely do that as well. And if you know anybody else who you feel wants to make this revolutionary change, please share this lecture with other people, share this paper, share these ideas, and definitely get active with us. We've got readings going on throughout the week, working on various papers, scientific papers, classical literature. If you're a young person, definitely reach out to us. We have a youth movement going on. Mrs. LaRouche will be giving a class coming up on the 12th of June, just before the conference the week after. So I'd like to leave you there, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Without any further ado, I would like to introduce L. Marcus, National Chairman of the National Caucus of Labor Committees, author of the textbook Dialectical Economics, out of the groundbreaking paper Beyond Psychoanalysis, and smaller companion papers which have appeared in recent weeks, which have introduced a revolution in psychological science. L. Marcus.
During a period of reaction which occurred among British intellectuals in the wake of the French Revolution, there was an attempt to explain creativity in art as being something which occurred within art itself, as independent of political movements of that time. In rebuttal of this, Shelley wrote an essay, one of his several important essays, and I'll refer to another one later tonight, entitled In Defense of Poetry. And I shall read a section from the conclusion of that, which is a thesis from which we shall work to provide a setting for the purpose of this program. The literature of England, an energetic development of which has ever preceded or accompanied a great and free development of the national will, has arisen, as it were, from a new birth. In spite of the low-thoughted envy which would undervalue contemporary merit, our own will be a memorable age in intellectual achievements. and we live among such philosophers and poets as surpassed beyond comparison any who have appeared since the last national struggle for civil and religious liberty. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The persons in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated on the throne of their own soul. It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled with the electric life which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations, for it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age. If Shelley's thesis is correct, that is, that great periods of revolutionary transformation are heralded and accompanied by an intellectual renaissance, then the Bolshevik Revolution and the period following it is ironical. For the Bolshevik Revolution was preceded by approximately a quarter century of general decay, accelerated decay of intellectual life in Europe and the United States, and has been followed by 50 years of accelerated decay in the arts. The situation in the sciences is not that much better. While there has been much elaboration, which is called fundamental advance in the physical sciences, so-called, there actually has been no breakthrough during the past 50 years, nor any sign of a new breakthrough in development, but rather an elaboration of those achievements, the fundamental achievements, which were made in the first 2 decades of this century. There's been, of course, a rather revolution in biological sciences, but that again falls in the same category. Essentially, from approximately the end of the First World War, this has been a period of accelerated decay. And if Shelley's thesis is borne out, there must be some correlation between the intellectual decay of capitalist culture and world culture generally throughout the past 50 years and the fact that there have not been heretofore successful socialist revolutions in the advanced sector. I would say that Shelley's thesis is correct, and that without an intellectual revolution, it will be impossible, perhaps not impossible, but extremely unlikely, that there will be a socialist transformation in the brief period left to us to do that. However, it's not quite so simple. We are, in fact, in the Labor Committee tendency, initiating an intellectual revolution. And the question of beyond psychoanalysis is essentially an attempt to get at the lawfulness or the lawful processes by which we will accomplish this revolution. We are not concerned, except in a peripheral and secondary way, to deal with problems of psychoanalysis per se. What we're concerned to do is to get at certain lawful aspects of the human power for cognition in order to unblock those mental powers which are necessary if we're going to initiate and convey, communicate the kind of intellectual revolution in progress. Is exactly what that is will become clearer in the course of the 4 lectures. This is not unprecedented. If one turns to the major works which preceded and followed the French Revolution, we'll find that this attention to examination of the laws of mind is by no means unprecedented. As I indicated in the article itself, the first systematic effort to deal with the lawful processes of cognition was undertaken by Descartes, particularly in the two theorems which I cited, which I'll refer to again tonight. More significantly, the principal work of Kant was essentially psychological in its purpose. That is, it was essentially psychological science. Hegel's phenomenology is nothing but a report of the laws of the mind itself as explored by one of the greatest creative thinkers of modern times, who used his exploration of his own mind as the means for developing his dialectical method, his phenomenology of mind. In the case of Hegel's immediate successor, Ludwig Feuerbach, the same applies. Feuerbach's essence of Christianity is, as he professes it to be, an exploration into the laws of human thought, the laws of human mentation. What we are doing here, then, is to make a further exploration, in a sense, in the tradition of Descartes, in the tradition of Hegel, the tradition of Feuerbach, and also, though with less emphasis in Marx's case, the tradition of Marx. Now, what we shall do tonight is to concentrate on the question of the context, the grounding within which we have to situate any attempt to establish a science of mind. However, before doing that, I shall just indicate some of the empirical features of the mind, and so doing will enable us to refer to these things as we go along, and then I'll develop these points in later lectures. If you examine the contents of your own mind, your own mental processes, you will discover, with a minimum amount of analysis, that there are essentially three accessible identities within your head. The first of these is a relic of infancy, which nonetheless is predominant, the predominant sense of self in most individuals in capitalist culture. It's the so-called ego, which is more properly should be termed the infantile ego. This is the aspect of your identity which becomes clearest when you say, I sincerely feel that I must do this, or I do this because I feel that this is true. It's the part of yourself which is immediately associated with immediate action and is associated with three kinds of emotion. One of the types of emotion immediately characteristic of the infantile ego is simple infantile elation at object possession. And object possession to the ego includes possession of people. That is, the elation that a child feels in having its mother, its wife, its girlfriend around is simple elation of object possession. There's nothing very human about it. The second of these emotions is the emotion of infantile anger or rage. And this type of emotion is what you are seeing manifest in the work of logicians and mathematicians and so forth. The essential emotion of mathematics is infantile rage. And that is no exaggeration. As a matter of fact, this becomes clearest in chess play, where there's a similar relationship. Across the board, chess play involves an emotion. The emotion is pure infantile rage. There is no human relationship between the opponents across the chessboard. The third emotion associated with the ego is infantile sense of fear or depression. And these three emotions are associated with the ego. Now, there's another entity, a second entity to consider, which you can experience by, and Hegel describes this somewhat in the introduction and preface to the Phenomenology of Mind, but it's something you can get at very easily, that you can, in a sense, be conscious of what you are thinking. You can be conscious of the mechanisms or certain of the dynamics involved in understanding why you feel certain things. Rather than simply feeling something, you can be conscious that this feeling is generated in you in a certain way. You can, in a sense, come up behind your own back, the back of your mind, and see what you are thinking, see how you are operating. This is self-consciousness. Now, self-consciousness, which in an adult society, which capitalist society is not, that is, in which human beings became adults and outgrew the infantile ego, the location of the sense of identity would be entirely located in this self-conscious self, which you can know empirically as that part of you which is able to look at what the other part of you is doing. In capitalist culture, in alienation, the self-conscious self is a rather weak creature emotionally. It generally does not know any emotions. It's simply a passive creature which is tolerated and utilized like a slave by the ego. It's used for thinking. Give an example. Some of you were exposed to a hideous experience which is called secondary school geometry. And in the U.S., that is a hideous experience. The pedagogy in the U.S. is, well, I'll get to that later when I discuss a German medical examination, which is one of the most hideous things that can be done to a human being. But in U.S. geometry, you're drilled in the following way. You're given a theorem or a problem, and the first thing you have to do is to develop a solution concept for this problem or this theorem. Then, that being a brief part of your classroom or related activity, if you're in a typical U.S. secondary school, you go through the literally anal process of detailing a proof, detailed logical argument. Now, in this process, there are two phases. In the first phase, in getting at the solution concept, you access self-consciousness and get what you might regard as an intuition of a solution. You play with this intuition until you are virtually certain that, at least as a hypothesis, this is a satisfactory solution. Then you turn your mind off and you get down to writing out the proof. There is no reflection in what you do for your grade in that class. There is no reflection of actual human mental activity. Because you do not reflect in what you write, you do not reflect the fact that you actually accessed your powers of reason and developed an intuition of a solution concept. What you report is simply the anal process of detailing this logical proof, something which is done in the ego state. Well, I'll go to that German thing. We had a problem in Germany among our members there, that we found that we have a significant number of members who are medical students. It's a fluke which one of the individuals here is partly responsible for. And we found that as they had to take their examinations, they would take off for 6 to 3 months to prepare for an examination. Didn't make sense, not to me. Then we found that after having the examination, that the individual was in a poorer state of mind, in poorer emotional health, exhibited more acute neurotic symptoms, was less able to think than before taking the examination. Well, I was curious as to what had happened, and I found out when I got to Germany and dug into it with them. We did some sessions and found out the horrible things it had done to them. Now, the first thing about this 3 to 6 month period was that during this period of 3 to 6 months, the people taking the examinations, that is, absenting themselves from politics and actually all other kinds of intellectual activity, had plenty of time to whore about and perform what would normally pass for students' recreations. But precisely all of their recreations were of the most banal and degraded sort. There was no real intellectual recreation, really bestialized forms of recreation. A number of them who went through this tried to do political work during the period that they were preparing for the examinations, and found they could not prepare for the examinations. What was the reason for this? When you look at the content of the preparation for a German medical examination, it may not be much better here. I just know the case in Germany. I don't know the case in the United States. It's strictly drill. It's a more extreme version of the same kind of problem which you run into in preparing the geometry proofs in the secondary school in the United States. Now, the mind will not tolerate the kind of memory drill required to prepare for such an examination if your self-consciousness is turned on. It's too degrading. So what the student was doing in absenting himself from political work, and it wasn't just political work, it was any kind of intellectually stimulating activity. The student had to cut himself off from all intellectually stimulating activity and reduce his life to merely grinding and drilling in memory for this medical examination, and otherwise keep himself on a fairly bestialized level in his social life and recreations. Then, of course, would come the end of this preparation process and go into a room, generally buy a suit for the occasion, and go into a parlor-like room, a dozen or so or a half dozen of them, sit around with 1 or 2 examiners. 2 or 3 questions would be thrown at them out of the hundreds for which they had prepared themselves. And then the student would leave the room and would have a real letdown and begin to manifest rather acute neurotic symptoms, as well as a general inability to do intellectual work. Well, we got into the depths of some of this stuff, and in effect, if you begin pulling up, and I'll get into this later, if you begin pulling up in analysis what had happened to these people, on the unconscious level, the effect was as if a large, more than slightly man-sized black beetle had performed sodomic rape on them. In other words, there was an acute sense of degradation in going through this kind of experience. And then, as we got into this with some of the physicians and medical students who'd gone through this process, we located a relationship between what is done to medical students in Germany and the sadomasochistic relationship among doctor, nurse, and patient in the hospital. So in general, in capitalist life, people who have any kind of intellectual activity access their self-consciousness, that is their reason. They are somewhat aware of what they're doing, what the ego is doing, but they're not able to do much about it. In the article on the sexual impotence of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, I outline this in some detail. In the case of the macho sexual pattern, an intelligent Latin American macho or Italian pappagallo, which is a feathered macho, finds himself in the presence of a woman under certain kinds of relationships. And in these cultures, there's a Madonna whore pattern to which women and men are both subjected. Is that when a man is playing the whore pattern as a pappagallo or macho, he is often aware that this is a degrading thing. He's degrading himself, he's degrading the woman. She is playing the same game. She's being either a Madonna or a whore and is aware of her degrading role at the time she's performing it. Yet neither of them, though they are aware of this on a self-conscious level, are able to stop themselves from doing it. They're like an alcoholic. And the alcoholic says, I shouldn't be drinking all the time. The alcoholic has liquor in front of him, drinks it, gets drunk, says, I shouldn't be doing this, and afterwards said, I shouldn't have done it. But he still does it. His self-consciousness is not able to intervene to prevent the ego from controlling his or her behavior. So that's the second entity, this self-consciousness, which in a healthy individual, that is what ought to be a human being, would be the location of the sense of identity. And then the ego. Now, this self-consciousness, this self-conscious I, is properly associated with a very special kind of emotion and its derivatives. I call this emotion the fundamental emotion, and we'll get to this a little bit tonight to qualify what it is. Normally, that is, among alienated people who are looking at this emotion or experiencing it from the standpoint of locating their sense of self in the ego, this emotion is experienced as what is sometimes called an oceanic feeling. It's an overwhelming, intense feeling which is usually experienced as a religious experience. It's what happens to people when they get into these evangelical orgies. It's also experienced more rarely in what people often call an overwhelming feeling of non-erotic loving. Now, the reason they call it non-erotic, because people generally identify what they mean as erotic loving as a sexual impulse associated with the elation of object possession. And they find that in this case, they are experiencing an overwhelming feeling, which they identify as some kind of feeling of love, but they identify this as being different than and opposed to the ordinary banal erotic feelings. This same emotion, this oceanic emotion, is sometimes experienced as a feeling of impending insanity or death. It's sometimes known as the love-death emotion. In Freudian analysis, nonsense is perpetrated, not as bad as Herbert Marcuse's version of it. Herbert Marcuse is a quack from all standpoints, both philosophy and analysis. But in an attempt to dichotomize this fundamental emotion, or this so-called oceanic feeling, and to report that there are two such emotions, one an overwhelming feeling of love and a counterposed overwhelming feeling of death. They happen to be the same emotion. It's just the sense of love and death are experienced in different ways. For example, in an evangelical orgy, that is, one of these fundamentalist religious sects is having a revival, and in the Baptist sect, for example, or Methodist sect, and they get the people whipped up and they evoke this kind of alienated expression of this fundamental emotion, which comes over these people as an oceanic swarm of intensity without shape and so forth, just a swarm. Or they feel it about to come. Now, here's where this trick of baptism is cute. Because of the nature of the emotion, it's easily identified with the ocean. That's why it's called oceanic. It's identified with water. The idea in these revival services, the idea in the mind of the individual that he or she is about to subject themselves to immersion in water, helps the individuals to release this emotion. That's why baptism developed. This is an alienated experience of this type of emotion. However, in a more or less healthy individual, that is, one who can locate the sense of identity in self-consciousness, this emotion is experienced in a less overwhelming manner. It's experienced as a normal kind of emotion, this emotion and its derivatives. In which case it becomes the normal emotion of loving, and also is the affective state which correlates with creative thought. There's a third entity of importance in this, in your mind, which in most cases in analysis would come up rather quickly as the image of a witch. This image is associated with the ego, that is, it's in direct relationship to the ego, and usually you will identify it with the mother. Now, the image of the witch is not, and we'll get to this a little later on in the session, is not an image or a product of the existent mother, but is a product of an alienated and infantile relationship between the infant and young child and the mother. And is this relationship which is alienated and distorted because the child has a dependency relationship on the mother which is established in infancy and continues usually through early childhood. The mother image, of course, is the dominant figure in the sense of infantile ego identity in the child and in the later adult. But because of the reflection of bourgeois relations in family relations, the image of the mother, or the image which is associated with the mother, is not a picture of the mother, and I'll qualify that in just a moment, usually comes forth as the witch. The belief in witches is a projection of this. Now, normally, this witch image, and there's some others which I won't go into here, but one can say that the paintings and sketches of Bruegel, Bosch, and Goya, particularly Goya's dark period, were not inventions, but they were drawn from life. They represent the type of images which people will get very readily under extreme stress, in which the contents of their unconscious processes come into consciousness, or in analysis. These kinds of images come pouring out easily. The witch is a third category. Now, normally the witch is not able to take over the personality directly. However, in certain psychotic states, that is extreme disassociation, the individual will find even the ego will be blocked from direct control of the person, and some other person is controlling the behavior, directly or indirectly, the witch. So these are the three entities which we will primarily deal with, and the emotions in dealing with the mind. Our concern, as I've already indicated by this outline, our concern is to understand the fundamental emotion, to understand the problems of self-consciousness, and, of course, from a clinical standpoint, to understand how to enable people to begin to make the transition from being alienated people dominated by their infantile egos into people who have more or less subordinated their infantile egos and have effectively located their sense of self in their self-consciousness. That is, in which the power to act, the power to control what the body does, is located in reason, in self-consciousness, in which this fundamental emotion is used to control to activate what the body does, as opposed to the infantile ego's rather banal and hideous, greedy little infantile operation. I'll just make one reference to, again, to another essay of Shelley's on life. Shelley says this: "Let us recollect our sensations as children. What a distinct and intense apprehension we had of the world and ourselves. Many of the circumstances of social life were then important to us which are now no longer so. But that is not the point of comparison on which I mean to insist. We less habitually distinguished all that we saw and felt from ourselves. They seemed, as it were, to constitute one mass. There are some persons who in this respect are always children," and so forth. That in my experience, that most people who have any talent as adults for creative activity generally had a fairly strong identification with this kind of fundamental emotion up until the time they were about 2 or 3. And then in the process of stultification, they generally lost the connection with this fundamental emotion, and were increasingly reduced as they grew older to banalized creatures who are capable only of these 3 infantile emotions which I indicated earlier. That is, of sensing them. The fundamental emotion is always working in a distorted way, at least. But in terms of direct types of emotional behavior, only the 3 fundamental, or the 3 banal types of infantile emotion were experienced. You get this in music in particular. For example, in Germany, in dealing with the problems of sexual impotence among a group of extraordinarily talented people, not ordinary emotional imbeciles, but very talented people, that never had they experienced a deep and intense emotion related to the fundamental emotion, or like the emotion of Wagner's famous Liebestod duet. They never experienced that in a relationship with a person of the opposite sex. Never experienced it in a love relationship. Had never experienced the emotion of love in a love relationship. But they had a weak feeling of love for a person. The minute they began to approach the bed, this banal feeling of infantile object possession took over. They behaved like a couple of animals, and so forth. But they never experienced the emotion of love in a love relationship. They had experienced it weakly or otherwise in another location, in music. One of the few places that people experience this kind of emotion normally. And we find it characteristic among musicians that early in childhood, up until about the time of puberty, they would approach music with a feeling of this kind of emotion, which they would begin to lose in puberty, and would lose their real musical insight, and would have to substitute their formal skills, virtuosity or whatnot, to maintain themselves as musicians. They had become, in effect, emotionally castrated musicians. Common problem in puberty, the loss of this emotion. So our concern is to identify what this emotion is, and define its relationship to this creative process. All right, I should just review what I covered in the article in this respect. Is prior to capitalism, the emergence of capitalism, there was no positive conception of man as man. That in no culture prior to the emergence of capitalism is there a distinct positive conception of man as man. There are essentially religious feelings which reflect man's perception that he is qualitatively different from the animal. But man is unable to account for this. It's simply something he feels and believes and ferociously attempts to defend. But it's only with the emergence of capitalism that man has begun to discover a positive conception of man, that man is absolutely different from the beasts. This emerged, and I've used a concentrated circumstantial basis for explaining this. That is, from approximately the middle of the 16th century into the middle or latter part of the 17th century, Europe went through an orgy of depopulation and misery in general, which I'm afraid, if capitalism continues, we're on the verge of now, or the like of which we're on the verge of now. There was general depopulation, cannibalism, and so forth. Yet at the same time, in a number of centers, England one, the Low Countries another, certain parts of France another, and a few other pockets, there was a flourishing development, a flourishing material progress. Now in every case, as in the case of Tudor England, and under the Tudors, from the accession of Henry VII to about 1589, the tutors and others expended fairly substantial sums for such tightwads on fostering technology. In addition, the London merchants and others also contributed heavily to this. So that in the prosperity of England and the prosperity of the Low Countries and other regions, there was a direct connection perceptible to all of the educated layers. A direct connection between the relative prosperity of these regions as against the misery of the others, and the fact that these regions were centers of invention. The invention not only in ordinary sense of technological inventions, but inventions in social and political forms. There was obviously a direct connection between creative innovations by individuals, innovations which, being actualized by the surrounding society, advanced that society. So man in that time discovered a connection between the necessity of his existence, that is, the misery of the world if you didn't make changes. If you tried to go on in the old way, the world collapsed, as opposed to the progress, the improvement of the human condition, which was associated with these innovations. Now, despite the fact that these innovations were actualized through collaborative social effort, through production and so forth, each of these innovations could be attributed to an individual mind. And thus, in this kind of setting, man for the first time was able to locate a direct connection between the very essence of continued human existence in general and the creative potentialities of an individual human mind. Therefore, the conception of man, as a scientific conception, first emerged in this period. The notion that the business of humanity, that humanity was distinguished by the fact that its members, its individual members, were capable of creative thinking from individuals, which was essential to the existence of the society as a whole. That is the essence of humanism. And therefore, society had to be concerned with, first of all, fostering those conditions which resulted in creative innovations by at least a certain proportion of the individuals of that society. Fostering the conditions under which these inventions could be realized, which included fostering the education and material conditions of life so that ordinary labor could employ this new technology, or use the printed word, and so forth. So the whole humanistic conception developed from this. This is embodied in a concentrated way in the work of Kepler, who said this most hubristic of all things. He said, the universe as a whole is rational. Since the universe as a whole, and he took the solar system, the astronomical system, as his frame of reference, as the empirical location of totality. So this whole is rational, therefore it can be comprehended by man, it can be comprehended by me. There's nothing God can do that I can't understand. Therefore, I shall set out to examine this astronomical evidence, this astronomical totality, and I shall adduce from the totality as a totality, I shall adduce a fundamental law, the fundamental law of the universe, which, in a sense, in his own frame of reference, is precisely what he did. But the first effort to understand this creativity and where it comes from was Descartes, particularly the two theorems I cited. And I'll just go over them here in summary form because there's a fundamental point, fundamental psychological point, among others, to be made. Now the first one, the cogitor, I think, therefore I know, therefore I am. I don't have a blackboard, so I shall painstakingly recite this. Can be represented symbolically in the following way. The symbolic form it can be described as follows. Is that for every particular knowledge, perception, etc., which I have of the world about me, this knowledge does not occur as knowledge in and of itself, but occurs as a subject or predicate of a process of thinking. Without the activity of thinking, there is no knowledge. Therefore, if some knowledge in particular is real, then thinking is as real as anything else I know, and it is more real than anything else I know. Now, thinking, the I think, is not in the same category as the perception of objects. I think is not an object, not in the ordinary sense. It is a subject for a category of predicates. I'll give an crude example of this, what I mean by this relationship. The concept number is not a number. I can describe all kinds of numbers, can give lists of all kinds of numbers, give rules for enumerating whole arrays of different kinds of numbers, and I can say that what I mean by all this is number. But number, as the category which includes all possible numbers, is not a number. Similarly, the category I think is not one of the elements of thought, of ordinary thought or ordinary knowledge. Now, the second theorem is a theorem of perfection. Man at any given point has certain knowledge, knowledge which is practically demonstrated to be real and appropriate. However, through the development of knowledge, man's knowledge of any particular category of experience is improved so that his behavior becomes more appropriate. There is a change in his knowledge. Now, this change is the effect, obviously, of creative innovations by individuals, socialized creative innovations by individuals. This knowledge is not the result, however, of merely existent individuals. You, as an individual, do not create new knowledge all by yourself. The problems which confront you are created by society. The culture from which you start in solving a problem is provided to you by society. The entire contemporary society is involved in the development of knowledge, directly or indirectly, but nonetheless necessarily involved. Preceding humanity, to this, Descartes applies the concept perfection. That the process of thought in respect to knowledge is perfecting itself. There is progress, there is advancement in knowledge. Now, here's where the gimmick comes, and here's where the problem arises. We could say that the subject of Descartes' theorem on perfection, that the subjects are the different knowledges which can be had in the same category of experience at successive stages of development. But that is not the case. The subject, the primary primitive phenomenon of perfection, is not a particular form of knowledge. The primary primitive phenomenon is the process of change connecting two successive states of knowledge. That is, the existent thing is not knowledge in the ordinary sense. The existent thing is a process of change connecting two successive states of knowledge. That's the primary fact. Let's go back to the geometry example I gave earlier. When you develop a solution concept to a problem, you do not calculate a solution concept. It is incalculable. There is no logical procedure by which gestalts can be innovated in the human mind. Logic will not do it. Logic cannot permit you to discover anything. Discovery is based on accessing reason, self-conscious reason. And when you do this from the standpoint of the infantile ego of capitalist society, the beneficial result you get from this, you call intuition. It's a process of reason, but you call it intuition. After you have, so to speak, intuited a satisfactory solution concept, then logic begins. You try to fit your new discovery consistently into the existing plenum of knowledge, of formal or logical knowledge. But the process of logically analyzing a concept to demonstrate its consistency with a body of knowledge is not the process of discovery. The process of discovery of knowledge is what we vulgarly call intuition. Same thing for Descartes' theorem. Knowledge cannot be logically defined. And to the extent that you logically compare two successive bits of knowledge, you have not gotten at the point of Descartes' theorem. What Descartes is concerned with is the process which we would vulgarly call intuition, by which man progresses from one state of knowledge to another. Therefore, the empirical phenomenon to be considered is not the knowledge in particular, the primary primitive phenomenon. The empirical phenomenon is the process of intuition by which two successive stages of knowledge are realized. Now, if you take what I said seriously, and don't simply take it from me as a plausible, edifying explanation, then most of you are in trouble. Because any of you who locate your identity primarily in the infantile ego are incapable of conceptualizing what I've said. Because to the extent that your sense of identity is located in your ego, there is no available referent to you in your own mind by which you could locate something inside your head which you would deem corresponding to what I've just described to you. That is, to the extent that you are in an ego state, it is impossible for you to find anything inside your head to correspond to the phenomenon I've just identified. You can only isolate what I've said, take the words I've said, repeat them, paraphrase them, but you still will not understand what I've said. You can, so to speak, draw a circle around what I've said. Define what I say in terms of that I don't mean this and I don't mean that, negating logical knowledge. But you cannot positively identify the concept which I have just identified. I'll just illustrate without going into it here. I presume we'll have a blackboard next week and I'll go through this again with this particular concept. We know necessarily that the so-called physical universe is not made up of what is normally thought of as energy. That is, the universe is not made up of simple, homogeneous quanta called energy. The physical universe is necessarily composed of a continuous process for which the term negentropy would have to replace what we call energy. This has been indirectly and implicitly recognized by a great number of people. Einstein, in his last years before his death, restated something which he'd stated before, that this problem of defining a unified field required a complete change in mathematics. That is, an essential superseding of existing mathematics by an entire new conception of mathematics. The difficulty in doing that is not formal. The difficulty is that the kinds of concepts required to solve those kinds of problems demand that the thinker who's trying to solve them be able to access in his own mind some category of mental behavior which corresponds to the phenomenon in the external world which he's trying to understand. To put it another way, if I ask most of you to identify what you know in any field, what will come out of you is a more or less a catalog of facts or things which are like fixed objects, facts, together with a set of rules or procedures by which you organize these facts. That is, your mind normally is capable of regarding as positive knowledge only two things. First of all, what we can regard as object images, discrete images. When you try to become conscious of something, you normally become conscious of discrete images. You combine this with notions of what we call relationship, which you represent ordinarily by procedures or rules. You can define that kind of knowledge. That is logical knowledge, or alienated, or better perhaps, anal knowledge. But ordinarily you have no reference in your mind for conceptualizing directly and deliberately process concepts. I give just a list of cases, historical cases. Spinoza attempted to define this, and did to a certain extent successfully define this notion of continuous process, and did that specifically in his Ethics. Joseph Schelling attempted to understand this. That is, Joseph Schelling tried to conceptualize a universe which was continuous, as opposed to a universe made up of discrete particles. But he could conceive of only a linear continuity, that is, like a homogeneous straight lines, homogeneous sheets, and so forth. He could not conceptualize a continuity which was self-changing. That is, when you think of something continuous line, you say, well, it's a homogeneous line. You can cut it up, it's always the same. It's like butter. You keep slicing it. It's always butter. What you cannot conceptualize is a continuity which is self-reproducing, self-changing. A line which changes itself as it moves. Something which changes itself with respect to time and is not composed of parts as such, but which necessarily creates discrete things. Schelling couldn't. And therefore, because of this failure, Hegel said appropriately that Schelling's philosophy, his conception of infinity and continuity, was of a night in which all cows are black. That is, Schelling could not account for the existence of discrete objects in a continuous universe, and therefore he simply had to assume that there was this wonderful continuous essence which somehow permeated everything, and therefore everything was like a cows, as Hegel said, in a night, in a black night. Hegel did have such a conception. Feuerbach tried to get such a conception but failed. Marx did develop such a conception. His notion of expanded reproduction, specifically his criticism of the physiocrats in the first part of Theories of Surplus Value, is an illustration of the fact that Marx did have such a concept. The famous freedom necessity passage from section 7 of volume 3 of Capital is another example of this, that Marx did have such a concept. That is, Marx was able to locate in his own mind a quality of the type which I've suggested that most of you could not find in your own mind, and Marx could conceptualize continuity. Well, that's the essential point here, is that to perform deliberate creative mentation, to conceptualize processes as processes, that is, real positive processes, it is necessary for you as thinkers to free yourself of, or free yourself to a significant degree of the type of mental behavior, mental life, personality or character which is given to you by bourgeois society. To free yourself from slavery to the infantile ego and the witch. If you do not, you cannot conceptualize these types of processes. Now this recently, just to indicate how real and concrete the problem is. We've had to deal with the problem of food. We are now confronted with dealing more intensively and programmatically with the question of energy on a worldwide scale, the same way we've dealt with food. But we have terrible problems, even within the Labor Committee, in effecting an understanding of the positive connection between this food campaign on the energy business and other kinds of political work. People will say, well, we have a food campaign, or we have an energy campaign, or we have an anti-slave labor campaign, or we have an election campaign, or we're doing contact work. This kind of fragmentation in which there is no understanding of the direct connection, the integral relationship between the food campaign and all other work. The problem here is of the same type. Is that what does the food campaign involve conceptually? It involves communicating to a working person a different sense of personal identity than he's experienced heretofore in his life, except perhaps when he was 2 or 3 years old. Since then, he's lost entirely this conception of identity. Instead of seeing himself as an isolated, heteronomic individual who, if he gets enough money, will be able to get food, and therefore sees food simply as a matter of how much money he has, and sees how much money he has as the social status of his position in life and so on. Instead of seeing that, he now has to see the production of food, his food, as being willfully determined on a worldwide scale by an interrelated network of productions which involves most of the people in the world, directly or indirectly. Therefore, he has to see his situation and his existence in a new way. He has to see himself not as an isolated individual against the world and against nature, but he has to conceptualize himself as a Spinozan person. He has to conceptualize himself as in positive relationship to the rest of his class on a world scale. Has to think in terms. Well, obviously an individual who thinks like that cannot be a trade union chauvinist, cannot be a black nationalist, cannot be heteronomic in any other sense. An individual who understands the food program really is a revolutionary socialist. He's got to be. Therefore, what's the dichotomy between this and any other kind of work? It's the most sophisticated, most direct kind of political education imaginable. Well, there are some problems that come up, and I'll just identify what the problems are. And you find them among workers. We reported one in Solidarity a couple of weeks ago. You go up to a man, a worker, and discuss food with him. He says, well, I don't know, my wife takes care of that, but I'm worried about it. But my wife takes care of that. Total alienation. He assumes that food is somehow something magical that his mother and wife provide for him. He gives his mother or his wife money and she provides him food. It's a magical relationship. You start to discuss how food is produced, how he's going to get it, and he's blocked. But even among us, we find the same problem. We find difficulty in conceptualizing this kind of relationship. Well, the way Eric and others have laid this out, even so far, you can see that what the production of food involves. It's not a simple matter of having a fixed technology of food production, having enough people work at it. The problem is we have to develop new technologies, and we'll continue to have to develop new technologies to meet human food requirements. So the question of a food program is not a package of technologies and recipes like a production program. That's only the beginning. But once you start that production program, you have to recognize that with existing technology, without new technologies, there still won't be enough food to meet the requirements that we have for the human race as a whole. Therefore, to meet the requirements of man as he exists today, we will have to increase technology. And as we increase technology, we'll find new barriers. We'll have to increase technology still further to raise the human standard of living higher and to reduce the total amount of human effort required to produce food itself. That is, to produce the ratio of effort just to find enough to eat. Therefore, this is the kind of process which people can get at algebraically by piece, step-by-step methods. But when they attempt to conceptualize this as a process directly, they find themselves blocked in it, both as a concept, and they find that there are relationships to their neurotic problems which are connected to this. And that's exactly it. If we treat the fact that people have an infantile ego, which they haven't freed themselves of, that this ego is essentially under the control of a witch, who in Catholic theology is known as the Virgin Mary or the Whore of Babylon. They're both the same thing. Now, the Virgin Mary and the Whore of Babylon are the universal for the witch. If they could free them, if they were not subjected to this, then human beings would be able to operate on the basis of self-consciousness. Their self-consciousness would access this fundamental emotion willfully, and they would find there's a direct correspondence between the basic content and form of this fundamental emotion and the types of processes that we have to conceptualize of the type I indicated. Therefore, the inability of any human being to be a creative genius, that inability is entirely neurotic. The only reason that any human being who is not physiologically traumatized, any biologically normal human being, the only reason that any such human being is not a creative genius is that he has severe neurotic problems. And the fundamental neurotic problem is bourgeois ideology itself, which is like a universal religion in respect to which people's private neuroses are like private religions, which they have in addition to the universal religion. The way in which we're going to approach this in the organization and outside is this. First of all, we are producing a series of articles, some of which I'm writing, which will explicate the process almost by a case study method. In the first article, Beyond Psychoanalysis, outlined the background to the approach. And the second article, which is appearing in this month's Campaigner, is the sexual impotence of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. It's a case study of a particular kind of problem, why Latin American revolutionaries are impotent in particular, which is merely an exemplary case for a problem which is rather pervasive throughout capitalist society. The case of the macho or the papagallo is only a more acute form of the sexual impotence which is commonplace throughout capitalist society. In the December and January Campaigner, there's a case study of Feuerbach, which in addition to dealing with his systematic problems, locates the root of his difficulty in a neurotic problem which is very evident in the contents of the essence of Christianity itself. That is, Feuerbach himself comes right out and details his neurotic problem for you in the pages of the essence of Christianity, which is a way of getting at the relationship between these neurotic problems and the general problems of religious belief as the conscious reflection of the general neurosis of capitalist society, that is Christianity. Beyond that, we are doing a study of the cult of Trotskyism as an exemplary case of sexual impotence in the form of a political movement. I will deal in a published article subsequently with the case of R.D. Laing, whose blunders in this respect are most interesting, precisely because Laing is a clinical worker, and therefore even though his interpretation of his evidence is wrong and his procedures are worse than wrong, nonetheless Laing is clinical, and therefore his material has some merit for treatment, as opposed to cretins such as Althusser, who's also part of the pro-insanity movement among structuralists and existentialists in Europe. Oh, that's quite serious. There is a pro-insanity movement coming out of the structuralists in France and others in England. This is understandable from the standpoint of the French form of the problem. Camus expresses it perfectly in his idea that the world is absurd. This is also expressed by Foucault in his book on folly about 15 years ago. And recently, in the case of the clinical schizophrenic Althusser, these and others are pushing a movement which is advocating insanity. In their own cases, they've succeeded. We'll also do a study of some of the last period of Malcolm X, which is most instructive. In his last period, what he was doing in his addresses, particularly at the auditorium uptown where we had the RIM conference, was to actually use analytical methods, in a sense, to try to deal with the characteristic problems of the black cultural nationalist, to try to convert him into something else. In addition to that, we are doing a considerable amount of clinical work, as much as the handful of qualified people available can handle, and therefore it's limited. But as this work progresses, because it intersects our general political work, the results of the work with a few is being transmitted to more in two ways. First of all, by making the results of the findings available. And another aspect of this, which I'll get into in the next few weeks more intensely, the reason we're able to do certain things in clinical work within the Labor Committee with success where we could not get the same success outside is that in order to transfer the sense of identity to the self-conscious self from the ego, it's necessary that the self-conscious self have the objective perspective on identity which corresponds to what it's trying to reach. You say, I wish to become a self-conscious person. Well, to be a self-conscious person, to make that convincing to yourself psychologically, you have to organize your life to act in a self-conscious way. But to act in a self-conscious way, as we shall indicate, to act in a self-conscious way means to act as a human being, a self-conscious human being, which means you take the existence of future humanity as the essential criterion for your own existence. That is, the criterion of your own existence is to develop yourself, to express as activity those kind of acts which are necessary to ensure the future existence of humanity as a whole. Now, unless the individual is actually committed to acting in that way, it is impossible for him to tell himself that he is becoming a self-conscious human being. You cannot become self-conscious if you say, I want to improve my mental state so that I can have a better relationship with my girlfriend. That won't work. That's not a self-conscious relationship. Your sense of identity is not self-conscious then. So therefore, it's only among people who are politically committed, who locate the very meaning of their lives and the criterion of every day of their lives in developing themselves and in acting for the furtherance of the future existence of humanity, only among such people is it possible to actually effect systematically progress from this infantile alienated ego state to a self-conscious self. Therefore, what we can do within the Labor Committee, particularly among the most committed people in dealing with this problem, is something we could not do, we could not replicate with John Doe and Jane Doe from the street. who said, help me with my psychological problems. It couldn't be done. They have not accepted the task-oriented precondition of really making a breakthrough. In such a case, we'd say, well, go to any psychoanalyst. They charge various rates, and they will probably do a fairly good job for you. We can't do anything more for you. We can only do something for ourselves to the extent that we are applying this knowledge on the basis of this special leverage, this tool, this political commitment. And there's a corollary to that. Is the reason we have to do this, this is not simply something to improve our functioning. We have to do this because we find among ourselves extraordinarily gifted people who are unable to mobilize the resources they have to do the acts which they want to do. Someone says, I want to understand this. I want to teach a class to these workers. I have to work with these kids in RIM. Well, this individual has all the essential mental gifts, that is, all the culture, the ability to handle the elements of culture, the dedication and so forth to do that job, but can't do it competently. Why? Because it can't control these kinds of processes. Now, this is particularly significant in dealing with workers generally and in dealing with the youth in RIM. These youth have terrible problems. If you can't cope, if you can't develop insight into the relationship between their emotional problems and their problems in life generally, you can't deal with them. You can only deal at them and hope that some of it sticks by luck or by accident. Every worker in general, every typical worker who is drawn into neuro, drawn into activity, is going to usually have a problem with his wife the minute he tries to be politically committed. If you can't understand his problem, and if you haven't got the competence to begin helping him free his wife from her oppression, her self-induced oppression, then you can't build a movement among workers that's worth anything. In organizing masses of people, you depend upon precisely the qualities which I referred. To be an effective mass organizer means to become, at least to some degree, self-conscious. To be able to locate your identity in larger masses and in terms of the long-term process, the future of humanity, rather than the immediate situation. You cannot operate as an effective political organizer if you are controlled by the opinion, or what you imagine to be the opinion of you, by the people among whom you're acting. If you're influenced by public opinion in the short term at all, if you're influenced, if that controls your judgment, then you're no good as an organizer. If you say, well, people don't like us if we do this, if that controls your judgment, you're no good as an organizer. That's your ego saying, I've got to get my goodies. I've got to be petted. I've got to be liked. Or I can't function. If people give me funny looks, I can't work. But that's typical of people. You get the typical organizer among our own members. Knows perfectly well what he wants to do. He starts to speak before a group of 4 or 5 people, and something happens to his mind. Something gets turned off. And where there was a clear conception a moment before, there's just ephemerai. The thoughts, fragmented thoughts, come buzzing about. Various kinds of feelings and emotions, conflicting emotions, come buzzing about. He gets himself together with rage and tries to express a formal argument for his case, which is really a banalized, Baudelarized version of our politics, which he's saying because he got up to speak. But before he got up to speak, he had a clear conception of what he wanted to say. But the minute he gets up to speak, his mind gets turned off. He can't think clearly. Typical member confronts a couple of workers. The workers show a little hostility or resentment or begin to exhibit their neuroses. A moment before, that member was perfectly clear on what he wanted to say to the worker. Confronted with this kind of emotional display or reaction of the worker, this member's mind gets turned off. He goes through one or several rituals, and there's no effective communication between him and that worker. So we're compelled to deal with this problem among a leading strata, in particular of our membership, because if we don't, we cannot fulfill the task to which we're committed, or only a handful will do it. And the great problem, which relates to what I said in the beginning, even from the standpoint of a revolutionary organization, in socialist movements in the past, and this is the mystery of the Bolshevik Revolution in a sense, entire mass-based organizations at best had a handful of individuals in them who are capable of doing thinking and organizing. The majority of members of so-called socialist organizations were merely errand boys of one sort or another working around a handful of actually qualified leaders. That's the mystery of the Bolshevik Revolution. You take Lenin and a handful of other individuals, and the rest of the Bolshevik Party from the standpoint of political quality was absolute crap. Look at Zinoviev, a totally bumbling fool. Kamenev, an absolute fool. Stalin, a degenerate Philistine lout, whose qualities were essentially those of a well-organized stick-up man. No, this is true. This is true, and this was recognized among the Bolshevik leaders. There were a handful of qualified leaders. You cannot make a socialist transformation in an advanced country with that kind of organization, unless you're engaged in a process where you're taking ordinary, committed people and enabling them to liberate that potentiality within themselves to become effective organizers. You have not got the striking force necessary to organize workers. Every time we meet a group of workers at a plant gate or elsewhere, there's a critical opportunity. And if in the follow-up, contact and follow-up of those workers at those plants, we had qualified cadres, that is, people who were intellectually developed along the lines I'm indicating, we would not miss those opportunities. But because our members are only an approximation of what they themselves intend to become, they make the contact and they goof it up. Not because they don't understand workers, that's bunk. Not because they don't wear a leather jacket. Not because they don't carry a lunch pail. That's not their problem. The problem is not they're not proletarianized. The problem is that they're not able to mobilize what physiologically is their potential for creative intelligence. They're not able to overcome their own ego reactions, to rise above the interpersonal ego situation, to look into the worker, try to understand what's going on inside him, and try to locate within him that to which they have to address themselves. So unless we do this, there's no hope for the human race. Okay, well, I think we'll get to the questions.
Okay, I'll call on people and they can then proceed to the mic. Questions and comments, please. Are there any? I see one in the back, yes. Is he the only one?
The issue number for myself, I've been doing some research into Asian ideology, Asian, as it stems out of Asian social structure, cavalry patterns. And in particular, I was reading a CIA type of book written in this country on Haiti a few years ago, and quite impressed at the degree of sophistication of these bourgeois scholars who had written the book into natural psychiatric characteristics in Haiti. Now, what I would like to up to the point where the psychiatrist, or the man writing the book, was unable to he was unable to conceptualize what he called a jump between this warm, physically nourishing infantile period and suddenly the Haitian individual being thrown into a hostile outside world which he couldn't deal with. In particular, the author couldn't conceptualize this idea of development as opposed to a codification, litigation idea. Now, the question is this: could you discuss what the problems are that the most sophisticated bourgeois scholars on this subject are capable of reaching, and comparing that with also the Soviet work?
Well, first of all, let me say one thing. I don't think the project's a very good one. First of all, you'll see that more clearly when you read the PSP article and think about it, and think about how it was put together. Is that to get at the mental life of any section, the subculture of culture and humanity, requires certain qualifications beforehand. And you're not going to get reliable results unless you bring those qualifications beforehand to the work. It might seem that good, rational study and so forth and comparison of sources on method would get the result. It doesn't. Because in any kind of psychological study, what the investigator is working with is his own mental processes. And what he cannot confront and locate within himself, he cannot see. That is, if there are aspects of one's own nature for which one is blocked, or if you cannot gain access when you need it to, in a sense, empathize with the inner mental state of the people you're investigating, you're going to come up with very bad blunders. It's commonplace. I want to, at this point, just to be sure, I want to stress the fact that as a leader of a political organization, the fact that I, with a few others, am undertaking this kind of work does not mean that I'm advocating in any sense the passing out of a license to practice psychoanalysis to a bunch of laymen. Either from the standpoint of clinical work, which can be absolutely deadly, is a person who is blocked, running around trying to lead group sessions or individual counseling, is a menace. An absolute menace. And it's only less dangerous because it will probably end up as largely a waste of time to attempt to investigate a culture. I'll just cite this PSP thing. Why was I able to put this question of PSP together? Because I had the clinical experience with actual cases dealing with this kind of phenomenon in general, to be able to understand in detail the inner life of the Latin American. With clinical qualifications. I could not possibly, from textbook knowledge, or college classroom education, or degree in psychology, or any of this other crap, I could not possibly have competently attacked that problem. You have to be able to see and feel inside the people you're analyzing. If you have not gone through the confrontation in which you yourself have gone through what we call depth analysis, that is where this fundamental emotion has been brought up, where you've had your sense the first time of your own death inside yourself. And until you've learned to cope with that, when that's no longer dangerous to you, when you don't faint, vomit, choke up, or the usual phenomena, when this starts, or jump into a baptistry font, only then can you do any analysis, because you never know. I never know. I generally get a hint of when it's coming on. But I will never know in advance when someone says, I want to talk with you. I will never know that within 2 or 3 hours, if I say I'm going to talk with you for 2 hours, I don't know that in the course of that time this person is going really brought up something, and that I've got to deal with this kind of crisis with that individual. If I don't know what I'm doing, if I don't know what this emotion is, how it behaves, if I don't understand how their mind works, I'm as dangerous to them as a plumber. Now, let me suggest, as I say, I qualify this. Under no cases, in my view, should people be attempting to launch projects in the psychology of a population until they are qualified to do individual analytical work, which means having gone through depth analysis, having recognized the roots of your own sexual impotence, recognized the problems of formalism and all the other correlatives. There are things that can be done, and one of the efforts we make is to chop out, from a few of us who are able to get at the basic problems, is to chop out pieces which people can work on. I'll give just one example, or two examples, two kinds of examples of what we're doing that fills those qualifications. For example, the case of the German medical student. We have a number of our members in Germany, including some of the medical students and physicians themselves, who are qualified and who are therefore continuing the preliminary analysis that we did with a population of these students to develop the complete clinical case on what is the psychopathology of the German medical examination system. That's going to be published. All right, these people are qualified. They've gone through all the way down the bottom. They've gone through depth analysis, and they're qualified to do this kind of work. Some of them are matured clinicians. In Italy, we're doing an article on the case of Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci, which includes a study of Gramsci and of the Socialist Party Executive Committee of the 1919 to 1922 period. The minutes of these meetings are published. In the proceedings of the Socialist Party of Italy during the period of the general strikes in 1919 to 2021, the minutes of these meetings are the most ugly display of political impotence you ever saw outside the Spartacus League. Here's a general strike as a revolution. And these revolutionary leaders, these clowns, are sitting at meeting after meeting trying to pass the buck on ongoing executive responsibilities for activities, including Gramsci himself. Now, in the case of Gramsci, who had a hideous mother, a hideous childhood, he was hung up from a ceiling on a board to try to straighten out his back, crucified as a kid, tortured as a child. It comes from Sardinia, a hideous place to come from. I mean, in terms of the circumstances, it's backwardness, oppressiveness. Well, the person who's doing this, principally, along with others, are people who've gone through depth analysis. They're qualified to work on the case of Antonio Gramsci. Other people are qualified to do peripheral work. Then we have other projects which are being done in Europe and being done here, which are on specific problems of epistemology. What we do in this case is for people who have not gone through that, have not qualified in the broader sense, but who have special 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 in the broadest from two standpoints. First of all, from the history of the various main philosophical currents in France today, their incompetence and their development, along with an examination of French family life, descriptively. We discussed this with the people in France, and they're going to put together, along the outlines of our discussions with them, put together a documentation of what is significant in French life, where one Frenchman really never knows another. They meet, the more often they meet, the less they know each other. Which is why the French believe the world outside is absurd. Because it doesn't exist. They're never in it. They don't know any other people. And they're also doing something which they started on their own, but which we're furthering. Apparently, in translating into French, we find that an advanced conception which can be identified in one sentence in English or in German will require several paragraphs in French. And there's a similar problem in Spanish. But the reason for this is partly the immortals, that the French language has been conceptually degenerating for the past 3 centuries. It is demonstrated that if you use a modern French vocabulary, but otherwise use the form of French as exhibited by Rabelais, that you can express modern conceptions in French, which you cannot do with conventional French of the immortals. So people who are qualified are doing that. But this business of people running off and taking an area of culture and trying to do a psychoanalytical job on a people is a mistake. The only way we get at this sort of thing is the same way we get at the PSP phenomenon. You actually dig into the problem psychoanalytically with people who are representative of that culture. You dig into literature. You learn what to look for. Just one example. The Madonna whore pattern. And this is not only true in Spanish culture, is that the typical man and woman, or the typical man and child, son and daughter, see their mother as simultaneously a Madonna and a whore. This is true throughout Latin culture. There's a reason for it. On top, she's a Madonna. On the bottom, she's a whore. As a matter of fact, in Puerto Rico, they have a precise saying for this. The face of Madonna, the body of a whore. This is also true in Italy, and it tends to be true in other cultures. In a sense, a Latin man, a typical macho, must have 2 women. He must have a Madonna, his wife, to whom his relationship is one of rape, essentially, and he has a whore. He must have 2 women. This is not restricted to Latins, restricted to Italians. It's a common problem, particularly in this day when impotence has increased in the culture that I know in the United States in the past 25 years. The present generation of sexually liberated youth are qualitatively more sexually impotent than their fathers, their parents, as a result of this whole suburban culture and the impotence of the culture. But the significant thing here is that in order to deal with this kind of thing, you have to recognize these phenomena, and you have to be able to go through the literature and other phenomena of the society to see that you actually are dealing with a phenomenon throughout the society. So in general, I would say on that, don't get into those kinds of projects. To get into such a project, you have to have people involved who've gone through the kind of pre-qualifications to which to solve the problem. In these various areas, the research should be restricted to the groundwork within which, at a critical point, a more profound or depth analysis of the problem can be made.
Further questions, comments? Yes. Do it a lot louder or use the mic.
Can everyone hear me now? I just want to find out 2 things from Lynn on this, which is dealt in the paper. One is from where, or how does the infant get this feeling, this fundamental emotion, which you lose there, too. And I can see somewhat how it uses it. From where?
Okay. What was this, the second question?
Yeah, line them up.
Yeah, well, you're the only one. Yeah, go behind it.
The main thing I like to find out from where does the infant, or how the infant get this fundamental emotion? And the other thing, why does it appear as a love-death emotion? Or why does it get death emotion at all?
Okay, well, the infant gets it from his physiology, essentially. As I indicated, well, let me just back up and say one thing about progress. Where in the article on Feuerbach, the case of Feuerbach, part 1 is a period which deals essentially with the Feuerbach's neurosis as such, and its significance is appearing in the December issue of the Campaigner, and will be accompanied by a 2-part piece on the case of Alfred Schmidt, who is the leading pornographer of the Frankfurt School. And that's literally the case. Alfred Schmidt is a pornographer. He's the professor of philosophy at Frankfurt and is the leading disciple of Adorno. The 2-part thing, first of all, there's an article which in shortened version is being published, which is by Helmut Bödiger, which was delivered at a Feuerbach referat held at Bielefeld this last September 7th and 8th. There's an introduction to that which is being prepared. Is that in the confrontation at Bielefeld, Alfred Schmidt left his session, in a state of rage, saying, "I will not be subjected to this." What he was being subjected to was the criticism which is published. So those two things are complementary. But in the January Campaigner, together with the second part, which deals with the epistemological implications of Feuerbach's blunder, there'll be a companion 2-part thing. First of all, a English translation of Georg Cantor's 1883 Grundlagen, together with an introduction by Thomas Merz, which is a summary of the significance of Cantor's contribution in terms of the general development, a certain line of work done by Riemann, Cantor, Felix Klein, into Einstein. There's another project which is in ways which relates to that, which is a general project grounding anthropology and ecology on a new basis. As a matter of fact, as a byproduct of that project, that the food and energy materials have been produced. When these projects have been carried further, and some of the people in Germany wanted to get into the physiology of this thing as well, we will be much more explicit with the aid of these materials in qualifying and elaborating certain things. But the point which was made in the article is the essential point. That is, the fundamental emotion is the characteristic physiological feature of mentation, which is developed in this psychophysical parallel sense in early development infancy. It's developed automatically. This emotion, because it is developed, elaborated in social relations, and is fundamental, has the quality of love. That is the affective name which goes with the emotion. But the emotion is nothing but the elaboration of the fundamental physiological feature of the processes of mentation. What happens then is that in the first or infantile period, probably during the first week or two, is the most after birth, the most frantic rate of development of the infant, even in hours. That in the first period of infancy, in most families, the infantile relationship of the mother to the child is least damaging and probably most positive in this culture. And during that period, this type of emotion develops to a certain degree, and generally continues to be experienced unless there's a particularly brutal type of early bowel training. It generally seems to continue in a weakened form into about the age of 2 or 3. That is, people can recall experiences and can recall the exact emotional experience that goes with the experience back to 2 and 3 where they recall such things and then recall a diminution of this afterward, and usually there's a whole history that can be developed which accounts for the particular way in which this capacity to feel this emotion was aborted. But in most reasonably healthy family relations, particularly one in which there is a positive relationship between the mother and father, or mother, father, and siblings, and the infant, that most children develop a fairly strong preliminary experience of this kind of emotion up to the point of 2 or 3. Then in the process of socialization, this is rapidly attenuated. There is usually a crisis point somewhere about 5, 6 years of age, in which there's a very sharp attenuation of this. Then there's another sharp setback in the capacity to feel this kind of emotion, which generally occurs at about the point of puberty, before or after. It's not puberty as such, it's social effects which are determined. So why does it feel as death? Well, there's an epistemological point here, is that the ego cannot tolerate this emotion. What happens is essentially that if this emotion is experienced, the normal sense of ego is lost. That if you do not have a sense of self-conscious identity, then the effect of the emotion is complete oceanic disassociation. That is a loss of a sense of identity, a loss of a sense of ego. Only if you have a self-conscious identity is there any preservation of the sense of I under the impact of this kind of emotion. Now, what it therefore is that in a love relationship, that is, in which the relationship among people is particularly intense, and this can be among parents and children, or it can be between young loving people, etc., is that when this relationship involves self-consciousness of the other's self-consciousness, we'll get into that later in the sessions, that there is an intensified sense of I in self-consciousness. In that case, if this emotion starts bursting forth, you get the kind of phenomenon which Wagner was trying to celebrate in the Liebestod duet. You get this intense outpouring of emotion where it's experienced as love. Otherwise, the outpouring of the emotion is a feeling of death or a feeling of insanity. The same thing. Another aspect of this is that this emotion is counterposed to what's called mother love. That is, what people identify as mother love is not love. The idea of mother love is the idea of possession of a mother. I'll tell you an ugly secret. There is no such thing as an electrocomplex. An electrocomplex. That is, Freud postulated there was an Oedipus complex of the man's relationship with his wife or his girlfriend or what have you, or his boyfriend as the case may be, as being an extension or projection of his relationship to his mother. That is an acting out of a repressed unconscious desire for coitus with his mother, his existent mother. Well, that kind of Oedipus complex is, in a sense, it's true. Is in the ego state. The normal individual, so-called in society, when he's performing coitus with his wife, if you could perform depth analysis on him at that time, you would get his mother's face as the object of his sexual lust. This is what we mean by the Oedipus pattern. That virtually every man performing coitus with his girlfriend is not performing coitus with his girlfriend, but is using her as a surrogate for the image of his mother in his unconscious mind. And only when you get to be self-conscious do you stop doing that. Now, it's assumed, the electrocomplex assumes that now the girl naturally, when she's in a bed with a man, is using the man as a substitute for a father. Not so. It ain't true. And it ought to be obvious. When a woman is performing coitus, she usually has a male image, fantasy image, consciously or unconsciously, which she identifies with the person she's using at that time. And the usual sexual relationship is using another person to give credibility and sensibility to a fantasy. You're not making love to somebody sexually because you love them. You have a fantasy, you want to actualize that fantasy. So you use a person in the same way that a playwright uses actors on a stage. Okay. Now, the woman will have such a male image usually. But if you go a little bit deeper and peel away the male image, her mother's face. That when a woman is in bed with a man, she is making love to her mother, not her father. As a matter of fact, to the extent that there is an electro pattern, which is more superficial, what it involves is the woman's identification with her father is the idea of sharing her mother's bed. That is, using her father. It's like, like a typical homosexual fantasy with two men using the same woman or two women using the same men, which is just a slightly disguised homosexual relationship. A typical pattern of repressed homosexuality is, for example, is the male who is only interested in women who are having a sexual relationship with another man, and therefore he tries to seduce them. Form of homosexuality. Or a woman who tries to seduce men who have a relationship with other women. So just a form of homosexual behavior. They have to recognize it. So there are these involutions, but essentially, this is the pattern. Now, in general, all through all life, all psychological life in the ego state is dominated by these mother images. The mother image is not mother. It's a synthesis which is created out of the basis of the attachment, dependency primarily on the mother, but older sisters, maids, nurses, all kinds of people from the early stages of life generally get flooded in making that image. For example, your child, if your parents brought in two nurses or three nurses at different stages of your early childhood, your mother image has got these nurses mixed up with your mother in building up this kind of mother image. Just to make it perhaps clearer, that in dealing with people, you ask them to describe their parents, mothers and fathers. How do they feel about them? What is that parent like? They'll describe it, the person. Then you probe the thing further. You begin to get a case history sort of picture of what the parent is like out of this person. Say, what did your parent do in such and such a case, and so forth. And you get a completely different picture than the person gave you in the first place. And yet the person still feels, even after disclosing all this and having it fed back to them, they still feel that their parent was the way they felt about them before. It just demonstrates in a crude way that the existent parent is not, the mother image is not a copy of an existent parent, but is a synthesis, which is primarily fixed on possessing the mother. But the normal kind of love, or what is called mother love, is the idea of sexual or sensual, more strictly, sensual possession of the mother. It's a banal, infantile greed relationship. Possess the mother. Possess the mother's attention. Possess the mother's feeding. Possess the mother's good wishes, and so on. But this is generally confused as being love. Feuerbach makes that kind of blunder. It's absolutely opposite to the real emotion of loving. And all you have to do is see the difference between degraded sex, the kind of thing a lot of people do, where they go out and get their sex for the night, or the brutal, sadistic, or sadomasochistic relationships which pass for mating relationships. And you contrast the emotion, the degrading emotion which is associated with that, which is mother love. Contrast that with real love, and you see the difference. But in general, therefore, because this is a suppression of the ego, it's a swarming of the ego, overwhelming of the ego, a drowning of the ego, and a suppression at that point of the mother image, therefore it's experienced as death. I'm losing my identity. The effect of bringing forth the emotion can be blackouts, fainting. In general, the first experience of this kind of emotion, or the experiencing of this by most people, is experienced as pure terror. Though, therefore, to sum it up, is that on the one hand, this emotion can be experienced by a normal individual in the way that Tristan and Isolde supposedly experienced it, according to Wagner. And that's under unusual circumstances. Normally, the emotion is experienced with a sense of death or pure terror. It's the same emotion, the same feeling. What the difference is that the love feeling is when there's some intensity of the self-conscious identity, I location, and the feeling of death and terror is the feeling of the death of the ego. The infantile ego is being obliterated at that time.
Let me get a number of people to line up by the mic, yes. Are there... Is there only one? Bob. And behind the man is right there. Anybody else? Yes. Okay. So why don't you step to the mic so it'll save time. And yes, over there. Good. Okay.
And my question is, if you continue what you were speaking about in this past answer, in relation to Lang's notion that he develops, his psychoanalytic notion around ontological despair, ontological insecurity. I'm clear.
Yeah, this is cute. Lang is really cute. Generally, when I run into these existentialist psychologists, I just shrug and say, well, here's another filthy fraud, a faker, a charlatan. But Lang is not a charlatan. He's wrong, but he's not a charlatan. That is, he's actually done some work. What Lang does, and well, let me just backstep 1 minute. There's a problem here. Is that if one performed analysis, psychoanalysis, from the conventional standpoint, saying, well, this is the normal form of society, not recognizing the problem of ideology or the alternatives, one would assume that the infantile ego represents a normal location of the sense of identity. That this is the normal modal form of natural, normal human existence. It doesn't. So that psychoanalysts generally have a tremendous problem and disorientation on just this account. They assume that the prevailing phenomenon of the location of the sense of identity in the ego itself, the infantile ego, represents a natural state of mind rather than a pathological state of mind. Now, this is the root of Lang's problem. Now, Lang makes another error. The other error is he recognizes that there are entities apart from the ego which are attempting to control the ego. In a sense, there are two principal entities trying to control the ego. On the one hand is self-consciousness, which is burbling and bubbling and to some degree wishes to control the ego. It stands opposed to the banality of the ego. On the other hand, the witch is trying to control the ego, the internalized mother image. And in addition to that, there's a whole gallery of all kinds of chimeras of the type portrayed by Bruegel, Bosch, Goya, etc., and usually seen in paintings of St. Jerome, generally. These little monsters, rats, beetles, whatnot. So these are others to the ego. Now, if you could strip away these alien controlling devices and let the ego run on its own without self-consciousness and without the witch, then the ego would really locate itself in its immediate sensual relationship to the world around it. But that's absolutely nonsense. That's absolute idiocy. It is literal idiocy. It results in schizophrenia. What happens when you try to do that? Oh, let me back up again and describe one thing which is very interesting to me. Is that in histories of individuals who've been taking LSD, the ironical thing was that people who were schizophrenics would frequently show no significant external effects of taking a dose of LSD. Whereas a person who was only a fairly reasonable neurotic and not a schizophrenic would go through all kinds of hell, visibly. You say, why is it that under these conditions the schizophrenic seems to show more mental health outwardly than the healthy person? What is this? Are schizophrenics healthier? Is everything wrong? The schizophrenics are really saying they can take the LSD and the rest of us can't? No. And this shows up in the history of people who've taken a lot of LSD who are simply neurotics, as they begin to get to the point where they no longer seem to show visible effects of LSD dosage. They build up a schizophrenic pattern. What's involved here? Disassociation. In extreme pathological states, that is when you're driving a neurotic up the wall, driving the witch up the wall, clinically you'll get the following kind of phenomena. You're looking at a person and imagine a sudden total personality change. That person is no longer there. Their voice is no longer there. The voice that you hear is not their voice, not their inflection. The pitch of the voice is changed. The intonation of the voice pattern, the intonation pattern has changed. Speech has changed. That is, the idiosyncrasies of speech have changed. Cliches have changed. Facial expressions have changed. Bodily movements have changed. It is though somehow the same physique, the same physiognomy, had been transformed to be a different person, as if somebody had inhabited that person and taken them over. Well, what has happened mostly in that case is you're usually accurate if you say, that's their mother. You're looking at their mother's face to the extent that their mother's face could be approximated on their physiognomy. It's a parody of their mother's face, usually in a state of extreme rage, either cold rage or hot rage. Their mother's tone of voice or something of that sort. Or otherwise, it would be their tone of voice back at the age of 4 or 5 when their mother was harassing them. This sort of thing. You'll find that in listening carefully to the sense of I at that point, that the I is no longer refers to the ego or the self-conscious self, but that the person speaking makes slips of the tongue which indicate to you a third person who is neither the self-conscious self nor the ego is doing the speaking. The witch has taken over. Now, to a large degree, that sort of phenomenon happens in schizophrenics or in dissociation, where the ego and the self-conscious I are both sitting inside the head, watching a performance over which they have no control. The witch is running the body. It's like the mother came in and said, get out of here, I'm running this household, and takes over the body. And then you bring the person back out of it, and they will report exactly the phenomena they went through. The disassociation of the ego and self-consciousness both at that point. You can watch this thing. Once you become used to it, you can see it. It's an empirical reality. It's a gestalt. There's no question about it. Now, what Lang does is become totally confused about this and assume that you can get the ego all by its alienated heteronomic self functioning in direct relationship to society. The fallacy of that is that the ego itself is a synthetic character. The ego is not a little hard ball which you secrete at the age of 1 day or 1 hour or whatever. The ego itself is a social product. It's a product of an infantile form of social relationships. It's a construct in that sense. It's a product of social relations and cannot exist without social relations. One qualification on this, which we'll get to again later, but it's got to be clear here. When you think, you may imagine that you make logical decisions. Bunk. You don't make logical decisions. What you do, in effect, is scan the internal, your mind, and you go unconsciously down into a gallery, into a pit, where there are a lot of opinion makers in which this mother image is dominant. And you say, in effect, what will be your opinion of me if I say this, do this, think this, act this? And they hammer at you, and therefore you very cleverly, in this sort of perpetual trial, Kafkaesque-like trial of the ego, you perpetually are trying to propitiate these bastards down this pit. And if you do something bad, you feel depressed because these monsters shut down your ego. They deflate your ego, usually in direct proportion to the emotion involved in the error you make, according to them. So that everything you say, everything you think in the ego state is controlled by the monsters in this pit. For example, we find this in the socialist movement. In the relationship of young people to their parents. They are afraid that the movement will do something which will offend their parents. Their political behavior and judgment is trimmed by what they think are the limits of tolerance of their parents for their organization. This is particularly the case at Swarthmore. Yes, at Swarthmore, typically, Swarthmore, by the way, is known as Mother Swarthmore. This was not developed by us. This is something which grew up naturally. And, of course, the Swarthmore mother is a wealthy or petty bourgeois suburbanite, typically, which means that she's been demoralized, castrated, and her life has been made meaningless in the post-war period in which nobody does anything of any importance. They just do a lot of things and they get status, but they don't do anything useful. Some of them were ex-workers, you know. A worker has potency. A worker is useful. He creates something. He knows that his role in the outside world contributes to the world's wealth. But what the hell kind of an identity can you have if your father is a salesman? What use is that? Or if he's a paper shuffler? It's a meaningless life. So, young fellow from Swarthmore goes home to his mother and says, "Mother, I'm in the revolutionary movement." And she probably will say, "Well, that's nice." And goes to a Republican tea. And laughs about it, you know, and it laughs about it in her own way. But then the point comes at which because she conceives of his being in the socialist movement as something that which you do when you're at college, or something you may do when you're at college. I'll give what happens in Latin America, for example, in Colombia. In Colombia, at the university, you can have radical activities on campus. But if you go off campus and begin to organize workers, you get shot. So mother thinks it's safe as long as you're going through this, it's sort of either on campus, or if you're just into this sort of radical socialist periphery which does sort of mill around the streets or something, anti-war demonstrations or things like that, that's all right. But if you actually start to go out and organize workers in a serious way, if you begin to confront the potencies, like if you say, "Look, Mother, we're having a campaign against Rockefeller." She says, "You mean you're running a sort of a token candidate?" "No, we're attacking Rockefeller directly, and he's mad about it." Then her reaction becomes quite different. This is no longer play. This is no longer a childish prank. And what happens, you find typically, that these people have great problems precisely at the point that the form of political behavior of the organization can no longer be rationalized in fantasy as equivalent to a childish prank. They can no longer explain it to mother as a childish prank. Then they get frightened. They become depressed. In self-consciousness, the self-conscious identity, instead of being dependent upon a body of opinion, of internalized social opinion, you are dependent upon the social value, your rational determination of the social value of your act for humanity. That which you deem useful to humanity elates you. That which you consider is a danger to humanity and its interests depresses you. But in this case, the location of your identity is still social, it's real society. In the infantile ego state, you're dealing with a different society, an internalized gallery of these internalized images, dominated by the mother image. So in both cases, the sense of identity can be maintained only. The I can exist only on the basis of a relationship to society. So the idea of an ego being in the world all by itself is pure idiocy. And what happens is something quite different than what Lang thinks happens. But why does Lang say this? Here's where Lang commits fraud. Lang, in his Divided Self, which he wrote as a young man, I think it was 25, 26, something like that, started as an existentialist structuralist. It's his profession. He professes to be an existentialist structuralist. He professes to be a student of Sartre and others. And therefore what he does is he, at that point, rationalizes his approach to psychoanalysis from the standpoint of his prejudices, his heteronomic prejudices, respecting Sartre's and existential and structuralism as well. And therefore he reifies or reinterprets a phenomenon, which is nothing more than reducing an individual by various degrees to an id-like state, that is, a stripping away of ego ideals, a desocialization, which finally will result, if you carry it far enough, in complete disassociation, can only result in total schizophrenia or equivalent syndrome. That is, it can only result in insanity. And that's the significance of lying. I'll deal with that in more detail in this article that I'm dealing with. But the essential thing is he fails to recognize that the external controls over the sense of self are not controls over one eye, but they're two different eyes. There's a self-conscious self, and there's a ego. That in the dynamics of the ego, there is both the self-conscious self externally seemingly trying to control the ego, and there's also this gallery of witches and other monsters trying to control the ego. Therefore, he completely reifies and confuses the question, and makes the case muddy because of his own obsession with this existentialist or extreme heteronomic conception of what the human mind is.
First of all, you spent most of the time in the opening presentation talking about this. Actually, how it's investigated. Most of the time in the opening presentation talking about love and talking about feeling, and then you tacked on the end of that a discussion about text orientation and practical reason. And I'd like to know why you think that they're separate. I mean, why do you think that? It came out in the lecture that you think those things separate topics.
No, not really. The problem is that the task orientation cannot be understood, as I exemplify by the problems of people dealing with the food campaign, which is a very clear task orientation, which is made very clear again and again and again, and people were saying, well, there is no concept of the food campaign, when there was a very clear concept which had been elaborated over a period of 6 weeks. What was the problem? Is there was an erotic block to admitting that a clear concept had been elaborated. The problem, as I identified, the problem is that task orientation is not understood precisely because of the neurotic block. Therefore, in order to get at the task orientation, which you return to, it's a perfect dialectical thing. You start with task orientation, which is almost like on an ego level. It's a simple task orientation, and you find there's a block to effecting it. So you get away from task orientation, you become self-conscious of the response to task orientation. Having become self-conscious of it, then you return to task orientation, which now appears in a new guise. And that's the point.
The point is what social society, right? The point is task orientation will exist to a degree forever, but building is not going to happen in social society. It's a fundamental feeling. And you, in your presentation, distinguish between task orientation and fundamental feeling.
No.
And in fact, what it seems to me is that in any actuality that we bring into existence, they'll be that. Not identical, but they'll be.
That's absolutely correct, Bob. But the problem is this, and the problem is just exactly the problem I identified. I'm not dealing with abstractions here. I'm dealing with real people who have one problem in general. The one problem they have is that if I identify continuity in which the fundamental feeling and the task orientation are one and the same thing, they can't conceptualize it. Therefore, what do? I identify the two elements which have to be put together as a unity. They are identified as two elements. What I do in the program, or in the series, is to increasingly identify this process and to say these two things are the same thing. However, then, I cannot directly communicate them as the same thing. Because to directly communicate them as being one and the same thing, I would have to have the result of the process already achieved. That is, I would have to have people who had already accessed, who had already become self-conscious in their sense of identity, and who had direct access to this fundamental emotion. Such people could immediately understand what I'm saying, but I wouldn't need to say it to them. The point here is to identify the two elements which have to be put together so that people can recognize in the inability to immediately perceive the unification of the two concepts as one, to perceive exactly what the task is to understand that. Because the point is these two things cannot be put together except from the standpoint which I'm saying has to be achieved.
I want to state that physiology. And I said, well, okay. You seem to be saying something that is right. And then you said tonight, you said explicitly that the source of the fundamental feeling is physiology. Now, it sounds like baloney to me.
Mm-hmm.
That, I mean, it generally has a lot to do with a lot of things people do. Physiology, but it seems anomalous. It seems anomalous. Why do you locate that in the love that you get that is presented by parents?
I know exactly what you're referring to, Bob, on this.
What?
On physiology. Now, what I'm telling you is that the standpoint from which you studied neurophysiology was reductionist and wrong. That's where the problem is. That's where the problem is immediate with you. Others would have the same problem in a less informed way. You have it from an informed standpoint, therefore you can focus it more acutely. Others have a vague sense that there's something, hey, there's something fishy here, something. What's this guy doing? All right. Now, if we demonstrate that the human mind, in forming gestalts, in creative activity, is doing something, then the physiology of mind is doing that. What's doing it? The Holy Ghost? The physiology is doing it. What we've demonstrated, if we demonstrate that this is the fundamental quality of mentation, then this is the fundamental quality of the mental physiological apparatus. But physiology says, no, this ain't true. And it uses the authority of genetical mechanics, etc., back to inorganic nature.
But that's fine. The question is, where does the individual get a sense of self, a positive sense of self?
This just the way Feuerbach identified it. The sense of self is, all right, look, I get what you're getting at. It's very simple. First of all, this is physiological. But how does it operate in the infant? What's the infant's task as a physiological thing? What's this poor little baby's task? It's born. What's it got to do? Survive. Well, that's not the answer. How is it going to survive? It survives on the basis of appropriate development of its powers to develop. That's how an infant develops. That's what's fundamental. Now, when is the infant able to do this? Can the infant act for itself? It can't. When is the infant able to act? It's able to act principally when its mother is present. That's when the infant can act, which means that the emotion is turned on by the mother. When the mother's away, this emotion is turned off. It's depressed. I'll give it the kind of thing to look for. Take a child, a young child, infant, 3-4 months old. Now, have a stranger try to care for that infant. And the infant will either withdraw, become depressed, scream, etc., or when the mother returns, it'll scream. It'll scream at her. Why? Because the infant is trying to learn how to control its world. It controls primarily by mediating control to the mother. A father who is home occasionally finds that the only way he can deal with the infant is to find the pattern of the mother's behavior with the infant, and as long as he follows something according to that pattern, the infant can respond to him. If he tries to impose a different pattern upon the infant will be enraged, terrified. Well, the infant, in this way, there is a relationship between the positive presence of the mother and the infant. Now, another little thing, the mother herself can become another person. Mother is not always herself. A woman who treats an infant normally in one way and then varies the behavior to treat the infant in a completely different pattern is the same thing and worse than an ugly nurse coming in and starting to be cruel to the infant. A child who is raised by a schizophrenic mother is in real trouble if this was impressed on in some way, in an effective way, in infancy. So this physiological process, which is this potentiality, this physiological process of self-development of the mental apparatus at this early stage, is focused on the adult society which cares for the infant. The adult society represents primarily, in the normal case, the mother. Therefore, the onflow and regression or suppression of this emotion is initially associated with the image of the mother. You see a baby, when it begins to recognize its mother, the mother comes into the room. What happens to the child? The child is elated. If the mother ignores the child or rejects the child at that point, the child is depressed. If the mother does not respond in a normal way, from the infant standpoint, the child is depressed. If this goes on too long, the child is absolutely terrified. If the treatment is inconsistent, the child is terrified. It's in this form that the infant, as such, develops and encounters this emotion. Such 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 develops the alienated or infantile aspect of this relationship becomes apparent, and the emotion is suppressed. In other words, it's a stopping. In other words, it's a stopping of development, which is the way which this emotion gets shut off. Is that what?
But the question is, in the early history, right? First, I don't know if you can put it in, say, 2 years. 2 years, right? You have phase 2. I'm talking phase 1, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
When the parents actually extend love to the kid.
Oh, I see what your problem is, Bob. I got it for you. Your problem, I see what you're getting at. You're saying that the fundamental emotion, you're assuming that the fundamental emotion is homogeneous. It's not. It's not linear. It's not a homogeneous quality which you know, with a coefficient, where you get more or less of the same quality. The emotion must necessarily change in internal quality as the child develops. The quality of this emotion is that it is a self-developing emotion. Self-developing. It isn't something that's the same all the time. The emotion, the character of the emotion is it is self-developing. It is not linear. It is not a magnitude, you know, an essence where you turn on the faucet and get so many ounces of it. It's a self-developing thing. It has the quality of life itself. It's self-subsisting, negentropic.
All right,
Okay.
Yes, next. Who's that? Jean-Claude. Could you speak slower and more discreetly? Louder.
As one of this precedent for development emotion should start. Similar to itself. I'm not concerned about trying to have a relationship between this somehow relationship that starts and that emotion. And I don't know any better terms to use, which I think I feel when I'm experiencing the discovery or acknowledgement of the truth or beauty. I analyze the words, specific sections of words, which elicit in myself such a feeling. Now, I want to find out whether there is an actual relationship between the experience of self-judgment and the fundamental emotion which you describe. And I'd like to find out also, because that's a corollary to the first question, whether it would be possible for a safeguard to emerge in any given situation, and the point at which you acknowledge the work of art, the actual possibility for increased raw material for fantasy. I'd like to know whether the procedure by which any individual differentiate between this methodologically increasing life of fantasy and consciousness of actual truth.
Well, first, on the first thing, on the elation of actual discovery of an idea is generally, I mean, you can generally say that is an expression of this fundamental emotion. It's not a direct expression of it, it's an indirect expression of it. The direct expression occurs in two cases. The direct expression occurs either in going at, that is trying to get a referent directly for a negentropic conception of the type I've indicated, or in the emotion of loving, that is actual loving, which is a direct, which we call the infinite form of the emotion. That in any creative activity, that is the formation of new gestalts, by what we call reason, or what you might call intuitive reason, the formation of these gestalts is accompanied by emotion, which, to the extent that that's what's involved, is an expression of this fundamental emotion, the elation of discovery of new ideas, which is really an elation of an enlargement of the cognitive capacities of the mind as a whole, because you never really discover an isolated thing. Any discovery involves the entire cognitive processes of the mind. And the difficulty in answering something like that, in respect to a particular case, is that in the case in which the solution to a problem results in the anticipation of the infantile possession of an object, the very solution to the problem can become the elation of object possession. For example, let's take the chess player again, the poor unfortunate chess player, who sees a combination by which he is going to slaughter his opponent. It's very difficult in that case to determine exactly how much of the elation may be due to a small amount of discovery and how much more of the elation may be due to the possession of the opponent's pieces. That's the kind of difficulty involved. One has to consider the actual situation to really judge whether this is, what this is. But in general, one can say safely that the emotion of discovery of new cognitive powers is an experience of the fundamental emotion. Now, as to the problem of fantasy, there's only one criterion, and that's a revolutionary one. To the extent that one's efforts are directed to directly solving a problem of insight, that is, a creative insight, or to the extent that one's activity is creatively or cognitively related to the actual processes of the world, then that's not fantasy. The best way to get at this conceptually, however, is perhaps not by someone discussing it, except to call your attention to the way to locate it in your own experience. It's not difficult, once you begin to get a certain amount of self-consciousness, to realize that you've flipped down into an ego state of fantasy. Mind wandering is perhaps a term for it. What is difficult to do is to communicate to a person who's living in fantasy totally that they are in fantasy. For example, undoubtedly, most of the people who enter the acting profession are totally dominated by fantasy. Most people who have a professional involvement with English literature, for example, are totally dominated by fantasy. Because what is this whole business? Plays, drama, so forth, is pure fantasy. It's merely patching up more fantasy material, you know, so people can masturbate better, because their old fantasies aren't working out. But the only way that one can directly know what is fantasy and what isn't is by comparing the two states, which is particularly perceptible when one's mind wanders and one finds that this wandering is destructive of the process to which one is committed, and then in turn looks back and sees where one's mind was wandering to. And then you begin to find out what is the underlying relationship. Why do you go to that particular form of fantasy at that point? Then what does the fantasy conceal as a deeper fantasy, etc., etc.? So the real way to distinguish the distinction of reality from fantasy is a process. It starts from what might be called purely rational criteria. That is, what is a rational form of the individual's behavior in the interest of humanity as a whole. And in certain respects, that kind of decision is clear, and one can distinguish the state of mind in which that decision is made. Now, working outward from that to subordinated tasks, which otherwise it might be muddy, one can find where fantasy, fears, depression, etc., are interfering with performing tasks of which one should be intellectually capable. For example, anyone who can't study can find immediately the reason they can't study. They will find a fantasy which prevents them from getting into creative study. There's no such thing as a person who can't study. There's no such thing as a person who organically otherwise can't do intellectual work. If you examine what's going on in the person's mind, you'll find that something happens whenever they try to study, whenever they try to do intellectual work. You'll find some form of fantasy is either immediately in the surface of their mind or is buried. You'll find their mind wandering to certain things, and if you look underneath that with them, you begin to find out what their mind is wandering to, and you begin to uncover fantasy. So ultimately, while we have certain clear indications of what is reality as opposed to unreality, that the ultimate test of that is the ultimate psychological truth from the standpoint of one's own self-knowledge is an ideological approach. That is, you examine your own pattern and begin to recognize how your witch behaves. I qualify this as I did once before, is that in dealing with a witch and the assorted horrors of the pit, that one learns in working with people, one learns very quickly that these damn things have a pattern. They're just like a personality. And once you get the hang of them, you begin to recognize them. You find that you can recognize what the person is thinking simply by looking at them, because you recognize what the pattern is. Once you begin to recognize your own pattern, you can begin to smell the witch. You can smell her up to her tricks. And you can ferret out fantasies. As I said, just to end this, the one problem of fantasy, of distinguishing fantasy states, among most people, they are not aware of the fantasy occurring. They are unconscious of the fantasy as an occurring fantasy. Their attention has to be called to the fantasy before they recognize that it's occurring. In many cases, not only are they unconscious of the superficial fantasy occurring, but the actual fantasy is buried much more deeply in the unconscious processes. And one would have to dig for that, and usually it comes out as a real horror. But once you find that horror, once you dig it out, smoke it out, get it in a cage, look at it, learn its tricks, then you know what the difference is between fantasy, because you know how the damn thing works. You know what it's up to.
In your bit, in your example on prehistory, you had for the inorganic earth, you had 3 parameters, and for that particular case, I don't understand why the third parameter must be the case.
Good. Yeah. That's exactly the problem of continuity, which I was referring to, which I'm sure is what you're identifying. The best way to see it, without going into questions of different modes of thermodynamical processes, is to go backward from the case of biological evolution, species variation, and recognize that the same pattern occurs in the evolution of inorganic processes, so-called. There's a differentiation of different qualities in a certain relationship to one another. The third parameter is, well, let's say a special kind of vector, to keep it as simple as possible. And the value of this vector is an exponential tendency, which is increasing in value, for an increase in negentropy, which is negentropy. That is, an exponential tendency for the increase in simple negentropy, which is the notion of negentropy which we're getting at. And the state of negentropy is the actualized effect of this tendency upon the whole universe, or the whole phase of the universe we're dealing with. Now, in animal species, or plant species, the increase, I'll use this one and work backward. The increase of one species, or the increase of a population of a species, or the introduction of a new species, means that more energy, in effect, is consumed from the entire process around it. But this is not merely consumed as raw energy, not as undifferentiated energy, but it is consumed as negentropy. That is, it occurs in specific form, like an animal will eat certain kinds of plants and animals and so forth. These must be present in a certain abundance for a certain mode of behavior which is characteristic of that animal, or of its technology, so to speak. Therefore, the precondition for the existence of this species in a certain density and population is initially a number of preconditions. These preconditions in themselves express a stratified moment of negentropy. Now the question is this: does this increase in the population of the species under consideration result in an increase or decrease in the negentropy of the ecology of the biosphere as a whole? If it results in a diminution of the negentropy of the biosphere as a whole, then the proliferation of the particular array upon which this species depends, there will be a diminution of this resource. Then the species itself will tend to contract through its reaction to the holistic reaction to the environment. Now, in inorganic processes, essentially the same thing occurs in the evolution of layers of what we might call roughly thermodynamical modes. Is that a process is feeding on an existent process or combinations of processes in the surrounding universe, or that phase of the universe. The question is, what is the effect of the process which is being maintained upon its context? If the effect of the process is to increase the negentropy of the whole system, and the elements on which its existence is dependent themselves reflect increased negentropy, then it is going to tend to perpetuate itself up to the point that a further differentiation is required, that is, a new species to complement it, etc., a new process, to bring the whole thing back and keep the process of negentropy going. In a crude way, that describes exactly what the problem is of conceptualizing a unified field, is that we start from a certain level of actualized negentropy. At that point, we can conceptualize the introduction of a new process, a special quality of process, out of these preconditions, which represent negentropy. If this process represents a mediation for the further increase of negentropy, the initial effect is to tend to reinforce its own existence and amplify its own existence. However, it's not so simple, because its expansion itself alters the structure, and thus tends to demand a complementary differentiation which supersedes it. Thus, we can say that the complexity of systems, in terms of their apparent number of modes, their apparent number of kinds of discrete events, that this complexity of the system will tend to increase in its particularities with respect to an increase in negentropy. Thus, since the whole system only connects in the way I've described it, when we consider this, for simple simplified terms, this vector, or this exponential tendency for increase in simple leg entropy, when we consider that, the whole system connects and becomes self-subsisting. And every feature which would be determined by the two preceding conditions is automatically subsumed as a predicate of this notion of leg entropy. Therefore, once you've gotten to the third by these two preceding approximations, you no longer need the previous two. Therefore, the third now accounts for every phenomenon which you previously would have accounted for in the other two phenomena.
I'd like to ask two questions. I've narrowed down all the questions I'd like to ask two. First one concerns self-consciousness, where you discuss it. If you have a mass strike, a period of mass strike permanent, it leaves behind it the signs of the heightened self-consciousness of the working class in the form of workers who are self-conscious, who weren't self-conscious before. You frequently see members of neighborhoods going through periods of what appears to be self-consciousness, which then appears to leave virtually no sign of self when it runs into various kinds of barbed wire. Goes to whatever. It evidently is there to an increasing degree, but it's negative in the sense that you were referring to before. It's kind of that smart part that looks from behind. But, it's weak and negative, it simply knows more. And we think of our contacts this way a lot, that, if they drop far enough out of work with us, they're as if they have minutes. They become like a person in minutes. But I'm speaking directly about our own workouts now, myself and others I know. What do you think happened in that case? Is it that the person is not actually self-conscious of what he's doing? Or is it that other people in the organization don't realize, congratulate yourself, themselves, about that person, don't realize the point at which they have to intervene? The second question is much briefer and more distracting. The second question is, do you think that if you have a particularly sadistic family background, that dealing with the actual person in your family, subsumes solving the problem coming from that background in another way?
Yeah. Well, let's take the second one first because it is shorter. No. The object of analysis is not to make you healthy by your going back to somehow improve the family models on which you base your capacity for functioning. That the relationship to the existent parents, for example, or settling accounts with the memory of the existent parents, is essentially a matter of understanding yourself in part, and is also getting the garbage out of you. That is, you are establishing a human relationship with existent human beings, and thus freeing yourself of the crap of having an erotic relationship to existent human beings. In other words, the relationship of the adult person to his parents is not one of need for their giving him identity, etc. The relationship to the adult parents is simply a matter of having human relationships wherever you have relationships, whether they're actual relationships with existent people or whether they're your understanding of your past relationships with existent persons. It's simply a sanitary thing. Now, apart from its analytical significance. The pathetic thing, the ultimate form of ideology, or let me back off and explain it this way. People will say to me, well, gee, I saw my father, I saw my mother, I talked to them, we now have a more human relationship, but gee, my father's still a failure and my mother's still somewhat of a sadist and a dummy. With a father who's a failure and a mother who's a dummy, how can you expect me to do anything? That is a sort of a hereditarian genetic kind of nonsense, which is really a real fraud. This is the real ultimate rationalization. Since my father is not well educated and my mother is something or other, therefore, what can you expect me to do? blaming their parents for what they should do with their existing gifts. The basic neurotic gimmick is saying, I am able to do nothing except as my parents and other people in this pit give me the sense of identity for doing it. The function of analytical development, at least in our context, is to free oneself from all of that crap. That what you're capable of doing has nothing to do with what your father or mother were capable of doing, or not doing, or whether they had athletes or whatever it was. This has nothing to do with your responsibility. Your relationship to them, analytically, is first of all clearing up, analytically, your past relationship to them. And secondly, is they are also human beings with whom you have close personal ties of one's past or present. Therefore, you want a human relationship with them, whatever they are. Yeah? But that's completely independent, except as a sanitary thing, from the fundamental task, which is to free oneself from any sense that what you're able to do has anything to do with what your parents did or didn't do. Huh? Right. Now, the other thing. Self-consciousness is normally accessed, as I said, from the ego. Is that when you're being self-conscious, you're not really being self-conscious in the sense of locating your sense of identity in self-consciousness. You're locating your sense of I, and Feuerbach says this. The I is located in the ego. The thou is the other. That's self-consciousness. And you use self-consciousness as a mirror in which the ego can see itself. Therefore, the ego becomes more intelligent. Now, how does the witch come in on this? Well, if you've got a good mother image, you know, sort of a good witch, not the wicked witch of the West type, but the good witch type, then the good witch lets you get mana, a sense of elation, from being having favorable intercourse, and I don't mean necessarily sexual intercourse, but favorable intercourse in general, with people. So that the young radical gets into a mass upsurge, finds that certain ideas which correspond to reason, self-consciousness, that these ideas are associated with activities in which a larger number of people are viewing his activities favorably. Oh, gee, a bunch of workers think we're pretty good people. And I associate what I do that the workers like before with my being reasonable. Right? In that sense, the importance of the mirror has increased as a determinant in judging, mediating what you'll do. But you always refer, first of all, check with mommy. You're self-conscious. Yeah, you look at the mirror of self-consciousness to determine what reason says you ought to do. But before you actually do it, check with mommy. And she says it's okay, fine. With a mother image. And that's the way it works. Now, what they find is immediate opinion attenuates. Workers aren't around patting you on the back anymore. Oh, well, that didn't work. So that the fact that there is an ebb as a result of the experience itself indicates that this was done in the ego state all along. Because if the I was located or had been shifted to self-consciousness, the fact that you had one such experience would be treated by reason as a scientific vindication of the method by which you got to that experience. And the attenuation of the experience would not be an ebb in your consciousness, but would be recognized by you as only an ebb in the situation. Right? And that's the phenomenon we're dealing with. We're dealing in the Labor Committee with people who are essentially, most of them, are essentially in an ego state, who are distinguished from, say, such imbeciles as SWPers. They're distinguished by the fact that they're using the mirror of self-consciousness, that is active reason, to guide their behavior. They generally have to settle accounts with what they feel able to do by arguing out the rightness of doing this with the internalized mother image. But in reality, there would be no need for this. Now, the same thing is true in the workers. But in a real workers' movement, where the seizure of power is the goal, this changes. It actually does produce self-consciousness. Maybe not the strongest kind of self-consciousness, but it does. And that's something I'll get to later, but I'll just identify it now. Is that the image of the father in religion is not the image of the existent father. It's the image of Nelson Rockefeller. That is, religion and the family regard the existent father, if he's a worker or something, they regard him as a poor schlep, who maybe is a good provider, but he's a schlep. The real man, in the image of the cuckold, unlike the typical worker who is in Catholic theology, of course, is associated with the cuckold St. Joseph, the guy who stood outside the door while the angel Gabriel blew his horn on the Virgin Mary. The real father is Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, the guy who blows the horn. Who's he? Is he the worker? No, he's not the worker. He's Nelson Rockefeller. He's the angel Gabriel. He represents potency in the outside world, the figure that has control of the lawful order of reality outside the family life itself. Well, the worker really becomes self-conscious when he decides, this bastard's got to go. Not we're going to make demands of Nelson, not we're going to demand that the Congress get rid of Nixon, but we're going to demand that Congress pack Nixon in its bag and leave. When that kind of determination is made, that's a shift to self-consciousness, because the worker at that point has made a self-conscious decision. Said, I take responsibility for the worldwide existence and development of the human race. That's the precondition of self-consciousness. The characteristic of self-consciousness is hubris, which says, I don't give a good goddamn what anybody thinks. I'm going to fulfill my responsibility to the future of the human race. And that's what I'll do. If I'm absolutely alone, I'll do that. That's self-consciousness. What the...
You're letting something cause you to stop looking at the way you're changing the world around you and start looking at apparent changes which are going on entirely inside you and saying, I have to accelerate this change or decelerate that change.
Yeah, it's like the Operation Mop-Up thing. What psyched people out in Operation Mop-Up? A few bruises? No, the Communist Party's been passing out bruises for years. Communist Party goon squads have been dishing out bruises all over the left for years. The SWP has been dishing out bruises in recent years, using goons. It's been going on all over the place. The cops do it all the time. The liberals order it done all the time. I mean, you can imagine the Columbia administration being upset about little few bruises with what the blood that they've ordered. No, that's nonsense. What upset people? It's the key to self-consciousness. What upset people is that the fixed order of reality, in which the Communist Party had to be an existent institution on the left as its major fixture, that this thing, we're saying, we're going to end that. We're going to change reality. We are expressing potency. And people, in their own words, got freaked out by that. They were freaked out by the fundamental, what's the first commandment? What's the first commandment? Written by this guy Ezra in the year 558 BC, I think it was. That's right. There shall be no other gods before me. And they got a story that goes along with that about how Lucifer got kicked out, but that ain't true. Lucifer's really Karl Marx, and he's coming. They just hope, I
guess my question concerns the difference between hubris and more comfortable self-love. That is, you can make a certain compromise with the ego. You can operate seemingly according to the moral value on this ego gratification thing. This ego will remember me, something like that. And this will reflect in organizing in terms of organizing workers along these lines. If you don't make a revolution, you'll die. If you don't do this, you won't have food. Why would that work?
Yeah. Okay, well, it's very simple. freedom and necessity. Say, well, if you don't do this, you're going to die. That sounds like mother saying, if you don't do this, you're not going to get your supper tonight. Right? Telling a worker he's going to die if he doesn't make a revolution. He doesn't know what a revolution is. The essential thing, the necessity is clear. So the worker really knows about the necessity. He has the existent knowledge, which he hasn't put together. He's seen food prices. He's now heard about the energy crisis. He's heard about all kinds of things. He's told the world is going to pieces. There's a disaster. It's a question of how many minutes he's going to have his job and so forth. He knows all about disaster. All the motivation and necessity for doing something is very clearly there. But he's inert. He's dumb. He's numb. Well, somehow it'll work out. Somehow it'll work out. Well, that's pure magic. He believes in magic. God is going to intervene, or maybe those flying saucers are going to come down and save us. Or maybe they'll deliver groceries by flying saucer. You know, it's cheaper. Anything would be cheaper than the EMP. What he lacks is the other. So when you're really confronting a worker, you're not confronting him when you're attacking about you've got to make a revolution, it's going to be a disaster. That is merely a necessary qualification of the evidence which you're putting together for him. That's merely a predicate of the process. Where you really confront the worker is the same way the mop-up confrontation involves a confrontation. You tell him he has the ability to do it. Now, well, how do you define his ability? You have to discuss with him the process of organizing. Because what's he going to say? Well, how many people we got in the organization now? You say, oh, maybe a few hundred. I don't think we'll make it. So that you haven't, if you tell somebody to join Neuro, now on the basis of we got to make a revolution, you really haven't said anything to him yet. You've said something which is true, at least it's formally true, and absolutely true, but you haven't communicated to anything inside him which makes that a positive conception. You say, look, first of all, fact one, if there isn't a socialist transformation in the next 5 years or so, there ain't going to be no human race. That's fact number one. Now, there's nothing around right now which is organized and has the strength to do it. Now, you know the other workers around here. They're pretty bad, aren't they? They're pretty backward. You say, of course, gosh, not like me. Well, see, what we've got to do is what we need, obviously, is a handful of people who will start the organizing process. So we can get this organizing process going at a rapid enough rate on a large enough scale so that we can begin to organize a sufficient mass. Now, if you cop out, you son of a bitch, then we've lost the dike here because you're maybe 1 out of 500 or 10,000 who is ready now able to make this step. If you cop out, and more people in your situation cop out, then we'll never get the 10,000. Therefore, if you make the decision to cop out now, you're selling out the human race right now. That's the way you present it to him. You present it to him by presenting the process in which he is a vital element. You go up to some guy and say, look, we need another rank and filer for the revolution. He says, how many rank and filers you got now? You recruit that guy when you show him. And that doesn't mean one meeting with a fast pitch. That means going back and back and back and bringing the guy along until he's up to the point that he understands enough to make a commitment. It means sustained organizing, not emergency mobilizations to go out and meet your contacts once every 6 months. I mean, once a 3-month contact rampage doesn't do a damn thing. But the next time you see the guy, he's forgotten everything you said to him the first time. It's consistent work. You showed the guy that he himself has something extraordinary inside him, that he's not a rank and filer. We get this damn kind of thing, for example of Neuro is a good example. We get this sense that Neuro is somehow a different organization, different from the labor committees, which is parallel to labor committees like a broader organization, which is a lot of crap. It's a lot of crap that Neuro is a separate organization of the Labor Committee. It is in only one sense. Only in the sense that there are a lot of workers who are not ready to make a commitment to the Labor Committee. And therefore, if you want to do something with them, even organizing, you have to allow them to function on a basis of reduced level of commitment. So they don't have to sign, they can only sign away 2 arms, they don't have to go throw their torso and legs in. That's essentially what it is. It's the same thing with RIM. RIM is a somewhat different proposition. These young kids have to go through a somewhat different process of development, teenage kids. But it's the same kind of process. The way you recruit somebody is not by telling them that they're a good rank and filer as necessary for the revolution. The way you recruit somebody at this stage is obvious. You want to recruit rank and filers? Well, you've got a big strike on your hands, and you've got to get everybody out. When you've got a big force, and you say everybody out, then you get rank and file. Or when you want to make a revolution, well, you want everybody out for that. No, this is not the day to go fishing or making the revolution. But otherwise, you recruit, particularly at this stage, only to the extent that you show the individual that that individual has something exceptional. That does not mean going down the street and saying, here's a guy, hey, you know you got something exceptional about you? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Because he may not be exceptional. Chances are 9,999 out of 10,000 that he's not exceptional. Not in that sense. You have to find the exceptional person. How do we find exceptional people? There's a process by which we know that somebody standing up in front of us is actually an exceptional person and should be told this. This should not be kept secret from him any longer. What's the process? We distribute. Out of our distributions, eventually, if you do it in a sustained way, so many guys respond. Okay, you've got a certain number of people. You begin talking to them. Well, you find so-and-so is a well-meaning dumbhead, so-and-so is good, but his problem is too acute, so-and-so has 15 children and 2 wives, not exactly in the best shape. And in that process, you get down to 1 or 2 people out of a whole area of work who you realize are really exceptional people. You realize that they're intellectuals. And of course, students sometimes have trouble recognizing that a worker who's not well educated, particularly, can be an intellectual, a real part of the intelligentsia. If you listen, you can hear that. You can hear the guy whose mind actually works conceptually, who's fascinated by process, who's fascinated by kinds of things, and whose mind is constantly working. He's frustrated at the stupidity of people around him. You find such a person, you say, look, don't you realize what your problem is? Don't you realize why you feel like the black chick, like the ugly duckling in this mess? Because you're different. You're a revolutionary. And you're never going to be at peace until you make that commitment. And here's why you got to do it. And here's how we're going to do it. That's the way you do it. That's self-consciousness. That's confronting someone. Confronting them with the truth about themselves and their situation. But it has to be the truth. And it takes a little time to get the truth across. Lies you can get across immediately. Truth takes a little longer.
Are there further questions, comments?
Okay. Well, I didn't begin in some of the writers of Hegel. But there's the idea first. And through a process of evolution, according to the idea from mineral and vegetable life to get up to man, where the idea becomes conscious of itself. And similar things, like when I was reading what you said in the analysis about construction poetry, out of yourself, I get a sense of something really being created. And it seems like to me, in my presence that something's being created out now. That's the way I am. That's the way it comes down to me. And I don't want to believe, in this magic. I don't feel like it's real magic. But everything I see, I can only conceptualize as like a fragment of this negative tendency. And that negative tendency is still like God, still like this. Okay?
Very beautiful. It's beautiful because that's exactly the way the problem poses itself to most people. Metaphor, Feuerbach referred to that. Feuerbach refers to that. That's one of Feuerbach's perceptions, is to understand that aspect of the problem. There is no idea. Spinoza was ahead of Hegel in this respect. Spinoza recognized that the form, that is the creative principle, and the substance were one and the same thing. That creativity is not a quality of substance, that creativity and substance are one and the same thing. And that when we say that particularities are a predicate of substance, we're saying that exactly that particularities are a predicate of substance. That the materiality of the universe is not... See, the difference is this. The conception of materiality, or corporeality, is of things which are made up of packets of quanta of energy, as a homogeneous linear quanta, energy, simple scalar. Right? But we reverse this relationship. That we say that quanta exist but only as predicates. They're only aspects, momentary aspects of a process. It is the process itself which is substance. Now, and this is what Feuerbach recognized. Feuerbach did two things, one of which was half legitimate and one of which was fraudulent. Half legitimately, he recognized that Hegel's understanding and the logos are one and the same thing. And in that respect, he said that unless oneself is able to reflect the understanding in this form, then the understanding must appear to one as nothing. That the absolute, that is, that which is all, that which is primitive, appears as nothing. And that's exactly what the problem is. And the problem is that, first of all, to have a positive conception of something, one must be able to reach into one's own mental processes and find a referent which corresponds to empirical demonstration of the existence of that thing in reality. That is, no matter how many times and how many ways one demonstrates empirically the existence of this primitive this negentropic self-subsisting positive, that unless the individuals who are hearing this demonstration and seeing it have a referent in their mental processes which corresponds to this in form, then they cannot positively conceptualize what they're experiencing. They cannot integrate it. They can only retain a circumferential knowledge of its existence, which is circumferential knowledge of all the details of the empirical demonstration. But then when they try to get at, directly at, what they, within the circumference, they can't get in it. Because they can't go in the circle, therefore the circle seems empty to them because they can't get into it. And that's exactly what the problem is. The appearance of nothingness is the inability to deliberately access the fundamental emotion as a referent for the empirical evidence of continuity. And thus the function of dealing with this problem is to locate and enable people to systematically overcome, because you can't do it overnight. It's a growing process, developing process, to systematically overcome the neurotic obstacles, or ideological obstacles more specifically, which prevent one from getting direct access to the emotion. Once you get direct access in a self-conscious way to that emotion, then the referent exists for conceptualizing these kinds of processes.